Leviathan, or the matter, form, and power of a Commonwealth ecclesiastical and civil. Thomas Hobbes. 1651. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 1. Of Man. Chapter 1. Of Sense. Concerning the thoughts of man, I will consider them first singly and afterwards in train, or dependence upon one another. Singly, they are every one a representation or appearance, of some quality, or other accident of a body without us, which is commonly called an object. Which object worketh on the eyes, ears, and other parts of man's body, and by diversity of working, produceth diversity of operants. The original of them all is that which we call sense, for there is no conception in a man's mind, which hath not at first, totally or by parts, been begotten upon the organs of sense, the rest are derived from that original. To know the natural cause of sense, is not very necessary to the business now in hand, and I have elsewhere written of the same at large. Nevertheless, to fill each part of my present method, I will briefly deliver the same in this place. The cause of sense, is the external body, or object, which presseth the organ proper to each sense, either immediately, as in the taste and touch, or mediately, as in seeing, hearing, and smelling, which pressure, by the mediation of nerves, and other strings, and membranes of the body, continued inwards to the brain, and heart, causeth there a resistance, or counter pressure, or endeavor of the heart, to deliver itself, which endeavor because outward, seemeth to be some matter without. And this seeming, or fancy, is that which men call sense, and consisteth, as to the eye, in a light, or color figured, to the ear, in a sound, to the nostril, in an odor, to the tongue and palate, in a savor, and to the rest of the body, in heat, cold, hardness, softness, and such other qualities, as we discern by feeling. All which qualities called sensible, are in the object that causeth them, but so many several motions of the matter, by which it presseth our organs diversely. Neither in us that are pressed, are they anything else, but divers motions. For motion, produceth nothing but motion, but their appearance to us is fancy, the same waking, that dreaming. And as pressing, rubbing, or striking the eye, makes us fancy a light, and pressing the ear, produceth a din, so do the bodies also we see, or hear, produce the same by their strong, though unobserved action, for if those colors, and sounds, were in the bodies, or objects that cause them, they could not be severed from them, as by glasses, and in echoes by reflection, we see they are, where we know the thing we see, is in one place, the appearance in another. And though at some certain distance, the real, and very object seem invested with the fancy it begets in us, yet still the object is one thing, the image or fancy is another. So that sense in all cases, is nothing else but original fancy, caused, as I have said, by the pressure, that is, by the motion of external things upon our eyes, ears, and other organs thereunto ordained. But the philosophy schools, through all the universities of Christendom, grounded upon certain texts of Aristotle, teach another doctrine, and say, for the cause of vision, that the thing seen, sendeth forth on every side a visible species in English, a visible show, apparition, or aspect, or a being seen, the receiving whereof into the eye, is seeing. And for the cause of hearing, that the thing heard, sendeth forth an audible species, that is, an audible aspect, or audible being seen, which entering at the ear, maketh hearing. Nay, for the cause of understanding also, they say the thing understood sendeth forth intelligible species, that is, an intelligible being seen, which coming into the understanding, makes us understand. I say not this, as disapproving the use of universities, but because I am to speak hereafter of their office in a commonwealth, I must let you see on all occasions by the way, what things would be amended in them, amongst which the frequency of insignificant speech is one. Chapter 2. Of Imagination. That when a thing lies still, unless somewhat else stir it, it will lie still forever, is a truth that no man doubts of. But that when a thing is in motion, it will eternally be in motion, unless somewhat else stay it, though the reason be the same, namely, that nothing can change itself, is not so easily assented to. For men measure, not only other men, but all other things, by themselves, and because they find themselves subject after motion to pain, and lassitude, think everything else grows weary of motion, and seeks repose of its own accord, little considering, whether it be not some other motion, wherein the desire of rest they find in themselves, consisteth. From hence it is, that the schools say, heavy bodies fall downwards, out of an appetite to rest, and to conserve their nature in that place which is most proper for them, ascribing appetite, and knowledge of what is good for their conservation, which is more than man has, to things inanimate absurdly. When a body is once in motion, it moveth, unless something else hinder it, eternally, and whatsoever hindereth it, cannot in an instant, but in time, and by degrees quite extinguish it, and as we see in the water, though the wind cease, the waves give not over rolling for a long time after, so also it happeneth in that motion, which is made in the internal parts of a man, then, when he sees dreams, enk. For after the object is removed, or the eye shut, we still retain an image of the thing seen, though more obscure than when we see it. And this is it, that Latines call imagination, from the image made in seeing, and apply the same, though improperly, to all the other senses. But the Greeks call it fancy, which signifies appearance, and is as proper to one sense, as to another. Imagination therefore is nothing but decaying sense, and is found in men, and many other living creatures, as well sleeping as waking. Memory. The decay of sense in men waking, is not the decay of the motion made in sense, but an obscuring of it, in such manner, as the light of the sun obscureth the light of the stars, which stars do no less exercise their virtue by which they are visible, in the day, than in the night. But because amongst many stroacs, which our eyes, ears, and other organs receive from external bodies, the predominant only is sensible, therefore the light of the sun being predominant, we are not affected with the action of the stars. And any object being removed from our eyes, though the impression it made in us remain, yet other objects more present succeeding, and working on us, the imagination of the past is obscured, and made weak, as the voice of a man is in the noise of the day. From whence it followeth, that the longer the time is, after the sight, or sense of any object, the weaker is the imagination. For the continual change of man's body, destroys in time the parts which in sense were moved, so that the distance of time, and of place, hath one and the same effect in us. For as at a distance of place, that which we look at, appears dimmer, and without distinction of the smaller parts, and as voices grow weak and inarticulate, so also after great distance of time, our imagination of the past is weak, and we lose, for example, of cities we have seen, many particular streets, and of actions, many particular circumstances. This decaying sense, when we would express the thing itself, I mean fancy itself, we call imagination, as I said before, but when we would express the decay, and signify that the sense is fading, old, and past, it is called memory. So that imagination and memory are but one thing, which for divers considerations hath divers names. Much memory, or memory of many things, is called experience. Again, imagination being only of those things which have been formerly perceived by sense, either all at once, or by parts at several times, the former, which is the imagining the whole object, as it was presented to the sense, is simple imagination, as when one imagineth a man, or horse, which he hath seen before. The other is compounded, as when from the sight of a man at one time, and of a horse at another, we conceive in our mind a centaur. So when a man compoundeth the image of his own person, with the image of the actions of an other man, as when a man imagines himself a Hercules, or an Alexander, which happeneth often to them that are much taken with reading of romance, it is a compound imagination, and properly but a fiction of the mind. There be also other imaginations that rise in men, though waking, from the great impression made in sense, as from gazing upon the sun, the impression leaves an image of the sun before our eyes a long time after, and from being long and vehemently attent upon geometrical figures, a man shall in the dark, though awake, have the images of lines and angles before his eyes, which kind of fancy hath no particular name, as being a thing that doth not commonly fall into men's discourse. Dreams. The imaginations of them that sleep, are those we call dreams. And these also, as all other imaginations, have been before, either totally, or by parcels in the sense. And because in sense, the brain and nerves, which are the necessary organs of sense, are so benumbed in sleep, as not easily to be moved by the action of external objects, there can happen in sleep, no imagination, and therefore no dream, but what proceeds from the agitation of the inward parts of man's body, which inward parts, for the connection they have with the brain, and other organs, when they be distempered, do keep the same in motion, whereby the imaginations there formerly made, appear as if a man were waking, saving that the organs of sense being now benumbed, so as there is no new object, which can master and obscure them with a more vigorous impression, a dream must needs be more clear, in this silence of sense, than are our waking thoughts. And hence it cometh to pass, that it is a hard matter, and by many thought impossible to distinguish exactly between sense and dreaming. For my part, when I consider, that in dreams, I do not often, nor constantly think of the same persons, places, objects, and actions that I do waking, nor remember so long a train of coherent thoughts, dreaming, as at other times, and because waking I often observe the absurdity of dreams, but never dream of the absurdities of my waking thoughts, I am well satisfied, that being awake, I know I dream not, though when I dream, I think myself awake. And seeing dreams are caused by the distemper of some of the inward parts of the body, divers distempers must needs cause different dreams. And hence it is, that lying cold breedeth dreams of fear, and raiseth the thought and image of some fearful object, the motion from the brain to the inner parts, and from the inner parts to the brain being reciprocal, and that as anger causeth heat in some parts of the body, when we are awake, so when we sleep, the overheating of the same parts causeth anger, and raiseth up in the brain the imagination of an enemy. In the same manner, as natural kindness, when we are awake causeth desire, and desire makes heat in certain other parts of the body, so also, too much heat in those parts, while we sleep, raiseth in the brain an imagination of some kindness shown. In sum, our dreams are the reverse of our waking imaginations, the motion when we are awake, beginning at one end, and when we dream, at another. Apparitions or visions. The most difficult discerning of a man's dream, from his waking thoughts, is then when by some accident we observe not that we have slept, which is easy to happen to a man full of fearful thoughts, and whose conscience is much troubled, and that sleepeth, without the circumstances, of going to bed, or putting off his clothes, as one that noddeth in a chair. For he that taketh pains, and industriously lays himself to sleep, in case any uncouth and exorbitant fancy come unto him, cannot easily think it other than a dream. We read of Marcus Brutus, one that had his life given him by Julius Caesar, and was also his favorite, and notwithstanding murdered him, how at Philippi, the night before he gave battle to Augustus Caesar, he saw a fearful apparition, which is commonly related by historians as a vision, but considering the circumstances, one may easily judge to have been but a short dream. For sitting in his tent, pensive and troubled with the horror of his rash act, it was not hard for him, slumbering in the cold, to dream of that which most affrighted him, which fear, as by degrees it made him wake, so also it must needs make the apparition by degrees to vanish, and having no assurance that he slept, he could have no cause to think it a dream, or anything but a vision. And this is no very rare accident, for even they that be perfectly awake, if they be timorous and superstitious, possessed with fearful tales, and alone in the dark, are subject to the like fancies, and believe they see spirits and dead men's ghosts walking in churchyards, whereas it is either their fancy only, or else the knavery of such persons, as make use of such superstitious fear, to pass disguised in the night, to places they would not be known to haunt. From this ignorance of how to distinguish dreams, and other strong fancies, from vision and sense, did arise the greatest part of the religion of the Gentiles in time past, that worshipped satyrs, fauns, nymphs, and the like, and nowadays the opinion that rude people have of fairies, ghosts, and goblins, and of the power of witches. For as for witches, I think not that their witchcraft is any real power, but yet that they are justly punished, for the false belief they have, that they can do such mischief, joined with their purpose to do it if they can, their trade being nearer to a new religion, than to a craft or science. And for fairies, and walking ghosts, the opinion of them has I think been on purpose, either taught, or not confuted, to keep in credit the use of exorcism, of crosses, of holy water, and other such inventions of ghostly men. Nevertheless, there is no doubt, but God can make unnatural apparitions. But that he does it so often, as men need to fear such things, more than they fear the stay, or change, of the course of nature, which he also can stay and change, is no point of Christian faith. But evil men under pretext that God can do anything, are so bold as to say anything when it serves their turn, though they think it untrue. It is the part of a wise man, to believe them no further, than right reason makes that which they say, appear credible. If this superstitious fear of spirits were taken away, and with it prognostics from dreams, false prophecies, and many other things depending thereon, by which crafty ambitious persons abuse the simple people, men would be much more fitted than they are for civil obedience. And this ought to be the work of the schools, but they rather nourish such doctrine. For, not knowing what imagination, or the senses are, what they receive, they teach, some saying, that imaginations rise of themselves, and have no cause, others that they rise most commonly from the will, and that good thoughts are blown, inspired, into a man by God, and evil thoughts by the devil, or that good thoughts are powered, infused, into a man, by God, and evil ones by the devil. Some say the senses receive the species of things, and deliver them to the common sense, and the common sense delivers them over to the fancy, and the fancy to the memory, and the memory to the judgment, like handing of things from one to another, with many words making nothing understood. Understanding. The imagination that is raised in man, or any other creature endued with the faculty of imagining, by words, or other voluntary signa, is that we generally call understanding, and is common to man and beast. For a dog by custom will understand the call, or the rating of his master, and so will many other beasts. That understanding which is peculiar to man, is the understanding not only his will, but his conceptions and thoughts, by the sequel and contexture of the names of things into affirmations, negations, and other forms of speech, and of this kindi of understanding I shall speak hereafter. Chapter 3. Of the consequence or train of imaginations. By consequence, or train of thoughts, I understand that succession of one thought to another, which is called, to distinguish it from discourse in words, mental discourse. When a man thinketh on anything whatsoever, his next thought after, is not altogether so casual as it seems to be. Not every thought to every thought succeeds indifferently. But as we have no imagination, whereof we have not formerly had sense, in whole or in parts, so we have no transition from one imagination to another, whereof we never had the like before in our senses. The reason whereof is this. All fancies are motions within us, relics of those made in the sense, and those motions that immediately succeeded one another in the sense, continue also together after sense, insomuch as the former coming again to take place, and be predominant, the later followeth, by coherence of the matter moved, is such manner, as water upon a plain table is drawn which way any one part of it is guided by the finger. But because in sense, to one and the same thing perceived, sometimes one thing, sometimes another succeedeth, it comes to pass in time, that in the imagining of anything, there is no certainty what we shall imagine next, only this is certain, it shall be something that succeeded the same before, at one time or another. Train of thoughts unguided. This train of thoughts, or mental discourse, is of two sorts. The first is unguided, without designee, and inconstant, wherein there is no passionate thought, to govern and direct those that follow, to itself, as the end and scope of some desire, or other passion, in which case the thoughts are said to wander, and seem impertinent one to another, as in a dream. Such are commonly the thoughts of men, that are not only without company, but also without care of anything, though even then their thoughts are as busy as at other times, but without harmony, as the sound which a lute out of tune would yield to any man, or in tune to one that could not play. And yet in this wild ranging of the mind, a man may ofttimes perceive the way of it and the dependence of one thought upon another. For in a discourse of our present civil war, what could seem more impertinent, than to ask, as one did, what was the value of a Roman penny? Yet the coherence to me was manifest enough. For the thought of the war, introduced the thought of the delivering up the king to his enemies, the thought of that, brought in the thought of the delivering up of Christ, and that again the thought of the 30 pence, which was the price of that treason, and thence easily followed that malicious question, and all this in a moment of time, for thought is quick. Train of thoughts regulated. The second is more constant, as being regulated by some desire, and designee. For the impression made by such things as we desire, or fear is strong, and permanent, or, if it cease for a time, of quick return, so strong it is sometimes, as to hinder and break our sleep. From desire, ariseth the thought of some means we have seen produce the like of that which we am at, and from the thought of that, the thought of means to that mean, and so continually, till we come to some beginning within our own power. And because the end, by the greatness of the impression, comes often to mind, in case our thoughts begin to wander, they are quickly again reduced into the way, which observed by one of the 7 wise men, made him give men this precept, which is now worn out, respice finem, that is to say, in all your actions, look often upon what you would have, as the thing that directs all your thoughts in the way to attain it. Remembrance. The train of regulated thoughts is of two kinds. 1, when of an effect imagined, we seek the causes, or means that produce it, and this is common to man and beast. The other is, when imagining anything whatsoever, we seek all the possible effects, that can by it be produced, that is to say, we imagine what we can do with it, when we have it. Of which I have not at any time seen any signa, but in man only, for this is a curiosity hardly incident to the nature of any living creature that has no other passion but sensual, such as our hunger, thirst, lust, and anger. In sum, the discourse of the mind, when it is governed by designee, is nothing but seeking, or the faculty of invention, which the Latines call sagacitas, and solertia, a hunting out of the causes, of some effect, present or past, or of the effects, of some present or past cause. Sometimes a man seeks what he hath lost, and from that place, and time, wherein he misses it, his mind runs back, from place to place, and time to time, to find where, and when he had it, that is to say, to find some certain, and limited time and place, in which to begin a method of seeking. Again, from thence, his thoughts run over the same places and times, to find what action, or other occasion might make him lose it. This we call remembrance, or calling to mind. The Latines call it reminiscentia, as it were a reconning of our former actions. Sometimes a man knows a place determinate, within the compass whereof is to seek, and then his thoughts run over all the parts thereof, in the same manner, as one would sweep a room, to find a jewel, or as a spaniel ranges the field, till he find a scent, or as a man should run over the alphabet, To start a rhyme. Prudence. Sometime a man desires to know the event of an action, and then he thinketh of some like action past, and the events thereof one after another, supposing like events will follow like actions. As he that foresees what will become of a criminal, recons what he has seen follow on the like crime before, having this order of thoughts, the crime, the officer, the prison, the judge, and the gallows. Which kind of thoughts is called foresight, and prudence, or providence, and sometimes wisdom, though such conjecture, through the difficulty of observing all circumstances, be very fallacious. But this is certain, by how much one man has more experience of things past than another, by so much also he is more prudent, and his expectations the seldomer fail him. The present only has a being in nature, things past have a being in the memory only, but things to come have no being at all, the future being but a fiction of the mind, applying the sequels of actions past to the actions that are present, which with most certainty is done by him that has most experience, but not with certainty enough. And though it be called prudence, when the event answereth our expectation, yet in its own nature, it is but presumption. For the foresight of things to come, which is providence, belongs only to him by whose will they are to come. From him only, and supernaturally, proceeds prophecy. The best prophet naturally is the best guesser, and the best guesser, he that is most versed and studied in the matters he guesses at, for he hath most signa to guess by. Signa. A signa is the event antecedent of the consequent, and contrariely, the consequent of the antecedent, when the like consequences have been observed before, and the oftener they have been observed, the less uncertain is the signa. And therefore he that has most experience in any kind of business, has most signa, whereby to guess at the future time, and consequently is the most prudent, and so much more prudent than he that is new in that kind of business, as not to be equalled by any advantage of natural and extemporary wit, though perhaps many young men think the contrary. Nevertheless it is not prudence that distinguisheth man from beast. There be beasts, that at a year old observe more, and pursue that which is for their good, more prudently, than a child can do at 10. Conjecture of the time past. As prudence is a presumption of the future contracted from the experience of time past, so there is a presumption of things past taken from other things, not future but past also. For he that hath seen by what courses and degrees a flourishing state hath first come into civil war, and then to ruin, upon the sites of the ruin of any other state, will guess, the like war, and the like courses have been there also. But his conjecture has the same uncertainty almost with the conjecture of the future, both being grounded only upon experience. There is no other act of man's mind, that I can remember, naturally planted in him, so as to need no other thing, to the exercise of it, but to be born a man, and live with the use of his 5 senses. Those other faculties, of which I shall speak by and by, and which seem proper to man only, are acquired, and increased by study and industry, and of most men learned by instruction, and discipline, and proceed all from the invention of words, and speech. For besides sense, and thoughts, and the train of thoughts, the mind of man has no other motion, though by the help of speech, and method, the same faculties may be improved to such a height, as to distinguish men from all other living creatures. Whatsoever we imagine, is finite. Therefore there is no idea, or conception of anything we call infinite. No man can have in his mind an image of infinite magnitude, nor conceive the ends and bounds of the thing named, having no conception of the thing, but of our own inability. And therefore the name of God is used, not to make us conceive him, for he is incomprehensible, and his greatness and power are unconceivable, but that we may honor him. Also because whatsoever, as I said before, we conceive, has been perceived first by sense, either all at once, or by parts, a man can have no thought, representing anything, not subject to sense. No man therefore can conceive anything, but he must conceive it in some place, and endued with some determinate magnitude, and which may be divided into parts, nor that anything is all in this place, and all in another place at the same time, nor that 2, or more things can be in one, and the same place at once, for none of these things ever have, or can be incident to sense, but are absurd speeches, taken upon credit, without any signification at all, from deceived philosophers, and deceived, or deceiving schoolmen. Chapter 4. Of Speech. Original of speech. The invention of printing, though ingenious, compared with the invention of letters, is no great matter. But who was the first that found the use of letters, is not known. He that first brought them into Greece, men say was Cadmus, the Sine of Agenor, king of Phoenicia. A profitable invention for continuing the memory of time past, and the conjunction of mankind, dispersed into so many, and distant regions of the earth, and with all difficult, as proceeding from a watchful observation of the divers motions of the tongue, palate, lips, and other organs of speech, whereby to make as many differences of characters, to remember them. But the most noble and profitable invention of all other, was that of speech, consisting of names or appellations, and their connection, whereby men register their thoughts, recall them when they are past, and also declare them one to another for mutual utility and conversation, without which, there had been amongst men, neither commonwealth, nor society, nor contract, nor peace, no more than amongst lions, bears, and wolves. The first author of speech was God himself, that instructed Adam how to name such creatures as he presented to his sight, for the scripture goeth no further in this matter. But this was sufficient to direct him to utter more names, as the experience and use of the creatures should give him occasion, and to join them in such manner by degrees, as to make himself understood, and so by succession of time, so much language might be gotten, as he had found use for, though not so copious, as an orator or philosopher has need of. For I do not find anything in the scripture, out of which, directly or by consequence can be gathered, that Adam was taught the names of all figures, numbers, measures, colors, sounds, fancies, relations, much less the names of words and speech, as general, special, affirmative, negative, interrogative, optative, infinitive, all which are useful, and least of all, of entity, intentionally, quiddity, and other significant words of the school. But all this language gotten, and augmented by Adam and his posterity, was again lost at the Tower of Babel, when by the hand of God, every man was stricken for his rebellion, with an oblivion of his former language. And being hereby forced to disperse themselves into several parts of the world, it must needs be, that the diversity of tongues that now is, proceeded by degrees from them, in such manner, as need, the mother of all inventions, taught them, and in tract of time grew everywhere more copious. The use of speech. The general use of speech, is to transfer our mental discourse, into verbal, or the train of our thoughts, into a train of words, and that for two commodities, whereof one is, the registering of the consequences of our thoughts, which being apt to slip out of our memory, and put us to a new labor, may again be recalled, by such words as they were marked by. So that the first use of names, is to serve for marks, or notes of remembrance. Another is, when many use the same words, to signify, by their connection and order, one to another, what they conceive, or think of each matter, and also what they desire, fear, or have any other passion for, and for this use they are called signa. Special uses of speech are these: first, to register, what by cogitation, we find to be the cause of anything, present or past, and what we find things present or past may produce, or effect, which in sum, is acquiring of arts. Secondly, to show to others that knowledge which we have attained, which is, to counsel and teach one another. Thirdly, to make known to others our wills and purposes, that we may have the mutual help of one another. Fourthly, to please and delight ourselves, and others, by playing with our words, for pleasure or ornament, innocently. Abuses of speech. To these uses, there are also 4 correspondent abuses. First, when men register their thoughts wrong, by the inconstancy of the signification of their words, by which they register for their conceptions, that which they never conceived, and so deceive themselves. Secondly, when they use words metaphorically, that is, in other sense than that they are ordained for, and thereby deceive others. Thirdly, when by words they declare that to be their will, which is not. Fourthly, when they use them to grieve one another, for seeing nature hath armed living creatures, some with teeth, some with horns, and some with hands, to grieve an enemy, it is but an abuse of speech, to grieve him with the tongue, unless it be one whom we are obliged to govern, and then it is not to grieve, but to correct and amend. The manner how speech serveth to the remembrance of the consequence of causes and effects, consisteth in the imposing of names, and the connection of them. Names proper and common universal. Of names, some are proper, and singular to one only thing, as Peter, John, this man, this tree, and some are common to many things, as man, horse, tree, every of which though but one name, is nevertheless the name of divers particular things, in respect of all which together, it is called an universal, there being nothing in the world universal but names, for the things named, are every one of them individual and singular. One universal name is imposed on many things, for their similitude in some quality, or other accident, and whereas a proper name bringeth to mind one thing only, universals recall any one of those many. And of names universal, some are of more, and some of less extent, the larger comprehending the less large, and some again of equal extent, comprehending each other reciprocally. As for example, the name body is of larger signification than the word man, and comprehendeth it, and the names man and rational, are of equal extent, comprehending mutually one another. But here we must take notice, that by a name is not always understood, as in grammar, one only word, but sometimes by circumlocution many words together. For all these words, he that in his actions observeth the laws of his country, make but one name, equivalent to this one word, just. By this imposition of names, some of larger, some of stricter signification, we turn the reckoning of the consequences of things imagined in the mind, into a reckoning of the consequences of appellations. For example, a man that hath no use of speech at all, such as is born and remains perfectly deaf and dumb, if he set before his eyes a triangle, and by it two right angles, such as are the corners of a square figure, he may by meditation compare and find, that the three angles of that triangle, are equal to those two right angles that stand by it. But if another triangle be shown him different in shape from the former, he cannot know without a new labor, whether the three angles of that also be equal to the same. But he that hath the use of words, when he observes, that such a quality was consequent, not to the length of the sides, nor to any other particular thing in his triangle, but only to this, that the sides were straight, and the angles three, and that that was all, for which he named it a triangle, will boldly conclude universally, that such a quality of angles is in all triangles whatsoever, and register his invention in these general terms: every triangle hath its three angles equal to two right angles. And thus the consequence found in one particular, comes to be registered and remembered, as a universal rule, and discharges our mental reckoning, of time and place, and delivers us from all labor of the mind, saving the first, and makes that which was found true here, and now, to be true in all times and places. But the use of words in registering our thoughts, is in nothing so evident as in numbering. A natural fool that could never learn by heart the order of numeral words, as 1, 2, and 3, may observe every stroke of the clock, and nod to it, or say 1, 1, 1, but can never know what hour it strikes. And it seems, there was a time when those names of number were not in use, and men were fain to apply their fingers of one or both hands, to those things they desired to keep account of, and that thence it proceeded, that now our numeral words are but 10, in any nation, and in some but 5, and then they begin again. And he that can tell 10, if he recite them out of order, will lose himself, and not know when he has done, much less will he be able to add, and subtract, and perform all other operations of arithmetic. So that without words, there is no possibility of reckoning of numbers, much less of magnitudes, of swiftness, of force, and other things, the reckonings whereof are necessary to the being, or well-being of mankind. When two names are joined together into a consequence, or affirmation, as thus, a man is a living creature, or thus, if he be a man, he is a living creature, if the later name living creature, signify all that the former name man signifieth, then the affirmation, or consequence is true, otherwise false. For true and false are attributes of speech, not of things. And where speech and not, there is neither truth nor falsehood. Or there may be, as when we expect that which shall not be, or suspect what has not been, but in neither case can a man be charged with untruth. Seeing then that truth consisteth in the right ordering of names in our affirmations, a man that seeketh precise truth, had need to remember what every name he uses stands for, and to place it accordingly, or else he will find himself entangled in words, as a bird in lime twigs, the more he struggles, the more belimed. And therefore in geometry, which is the only science that it hath pleased God hitherto to bestow on mankind, men begin at settling the significations of their words, which settling of significations, they call definitions, and place them in the beginning of their reckoning. By this it appears how necessary it is for any man that aspires to true knowledge, to examine the definitions of former authors, and either to correct them, where they are negligently set down, or to make them himself. For the errors of definitions multiply themselves, according as the reckoning proceeds, and lead men into absurdities, which at last they see, but cannot avoid, without reckoning anew from the beginning, in which lies the foundation of their errors. From whence it happens, that they which trust to books, do as they that cast up many little sums into a greater, without considering whether those little sums were rightly cast up or not, and at last finding the error visible, and not mistrusting their first grounds, know not which way to clear themselves, but spend time in fluttering over their books, as birds that entering by the chimney, and finding themselves enclosed in a chamber, flitter at the false light of a glass window, for want of wit to consider which way they came in. So that in the right definition of names, lies the first use of speech, which is the acquisition of science, and in wrong, or no definitions lies the first abuse, from which proceed all false and senseless tenets, which make those men that take their instruction from the authority of books, and not from their own meditation, to be as much below the condition of ignorant men, as men endued with true science are above it. For between true science and erroneous doctrines, ignorance is in the middle. Natural sense and imagination are not subject to absurdity. Nature itself cannot err, and as men abound in copiousness of language, so they become more wise, or more mad than ordinary. Nor is it possible without letters for any man to become either excellently wise, or, unless his memory be hurt by disease, or ill constitution of organs, excellently foolish. For words are wise men's counters, they do but reckon by them, but they are the money of fools, that value them by the authority of an Aristotle, a Cicero, or a Thomas, or any other doctor whatsoever, if but a man. Subject to names. Subject to names, is whatsoever can enter into, or be considered in an account, and be added one to another to make a sum, or subtracted one from another, and leave a remainder. The Latines called accounts of money rationes, and accounting, ratiocinatio, and that which we in bills or books of account call items, they called nomina, that is, names, and thence it seems to proceed, that they extended the word ratio, to the faculty of reckoning in all other things. The Greeks had but one word logos, for both speech and reason, not that they thought there was no speech without reason, but no reasoning without speech, and the act of reasoning they called syllogism, which signifieth summing up of the consequences of one saying to another. And because the same things may enter into account for divers accidents, their names are, to show that diversity, diversely rested, and diversified. This diversity of names may be reduced to 4 general heads. First, a thing may enter into account for matter, or body, as living, sensible, rational, hot, cold, moved, quiet, with all which names the word matter, or body is understood, all such, being names of matter. Secondly, it may enter into account, or be considered, for some accident or quality, which we conceive to be in it, as for being moved, for being so long, for being hot, and then, of the name of the thing itself, by a little change or resting, we make a name for that accident, which we consider, and for living put into account life, for moved, motion, for hot, heat, for long, length, and the like. And all such names, are the names of the accidents and properties, by which one matter and body is distinguished from another. These are called names abstract, because severed, not from matter, but from the account of matter. Thirdly, we bring into account the properties of our own bodies, whereby we make such distinction, as when anything is seen by us, we reckon not the thing itself, but the sight, the color, the idea of it in the fancy, and when anything is heard, we reckon it not, but the hearing, or sound only, which is our fancy or conception of it by the ear, and such are names of fancies. Fourthly, we bring into account, consider and give names, to names themselves, and to speeches, for general, universal, special, equivocal are names of names. And affirmation, interrogation, commandment, narration, syllogism, sermon, oration, and many other such, are names of speeches. Use of names positive. And this is all the variety of names positive, which are put to mark somewhat which is in nature, or may be feigned by the mind of man, as bodies that are, or may be conceived to be, or of bodies, the properties that are, or may be feigned to be, or words in speech. Negative names with their uses. There be also other names, called negative, which are notes to signify that a word is not the name of the thing in question, as these words nothing, no man, infinite, indocible, 314, and the like, which are nevertheless of use in reckoning, or in correcting of reckoning, and call to mind our past cogitations, though they be not names of any thing, because they make us refuse to admit of names not rightly used. Words insignificant. All other names, are but insignificant sounds, and those of 2 sorts. 1. When they are new, and yet their meaning not explained by definition, whereof there have been abundance coined by schoolmen, and puzzled philosophers. Another, when men make a name of 2 names, whose significations are contradictory and inconsistent, as this name, an incorporeal body, or, which is all one, an incorporeal substance, and a great number more. For whensoever any affirmation is false, the 2 names of which it is composed, put together and made one, signify nothing at all. For example, if it be a false affirmation to say a quadrangle is round, the word round quadrangle signifies nothing, but is a mere sound. So likewise if it be false, to say that virtue can be powered, or blown up and down, the words in powered virtue, in blown virtue, are as absurd and insignificant, as a round quadrangle. And therefore you shall hardly meet with a senseless and insignificant word, that is not made up of some Latin or Greek names. A Frenchman seldom hears our Saviour called by the name of parole, but by the name of verb often, yet verb and parole differ no more, but that one is Latin, the other French. Understanding. When a man upon the hearing of any speech, hath those thoughts which the words of that speech, and their connection, were ordained and constituted to signify, then he is said to understand it, understanding being nothing else, but conception caused by speech. And therefore if speech be peculiar to man, as for aught I know it is, then is understanding peculiar to him also. And therefore of absurd and false affirmations, in case they be universal, there can be no understanding, though many think they understand, then, when they do but repeat the words softly, or con them in their mind. What kinds of speeches signify the appetites, aversions, and passions of man's mind, and of their use and abuse, I shall speak when I have spoken of the passions. Inconstant names. The names of such things as affect us, that is, which please and displease us, because all men be not alike affected with the same thing, nor the same man at all times, are in the common discourses of men, of inconstant signification. For seeing all names are imposed to signify our conceptions, and all our affections are but conceptions, when we conceive the same things differently, we can hardly avoid different naming of them. For though the nature of that we conceive be the same, yet the diversity of our reception of it, in respect of different constitutions of body, and prejudices of opinion, gives everything a tincture of our different passions. And therefore in reasoning, a man must take heed of words, which besides the signification of what we imagine of their nature, disposition, and interest of the speaker, such as are the names of virtues, and vices, for one man calleth wisdom, what another calleth fear, and one cruelty, what another justice, one prodigality, what another magnanimity, one gravity, what another stupidity, and therefore such names can never be true grounds of any ratiocination. No more can metaphors and tropes of speech, but these are less dangerous, because they profess their inconstancy, which the other do not. Chapter 5. Of Reason and Science. Reason what it is. When a man reasoneth, he does nothing else but conceive a sum total, from addition of parcels, or conceive a remainder, from subtraction of one sum from another, which, if it be done by words, is conceiving of the consequence of the names of all the parts, to the name of the whole, or from the names of the whole and one part, to the name of the other part. And though in some things, as in numbers, besides adding and subtracting, men name other operations, as multiplying and dividing, yet they are the same, for multiplication is but addition together of things equal, and division but subtracting of one thing, as often as we can. These operations are not incident to numbers only, but to all manner of things that can be added together, and taken one out of another. For as arithmeticians teach to add and subtract in numbers, so the geometricians teach the same in lines, figures, solid and superficial, angles, proportions, times, degrees of swiftness, force, power, and the like. The logicians teach the same in consequences of words, adding together two names, to make an affirmation, and two affirmations, to make a syllogism, and many syllogisms to make a demonstration, and from the sum, or conclusion of a syllogism, they subtract one proposition, to finde the other. Writers of politique, add together passions, to find men's duties, and lawyers, laws and facts, to find what is right and wrong in the actions of private men. In sum, in what matter soever there is place for addition and subtraction, there also is place for reason, and where these have no place, their reason has nothing at all to do. Reason defined. Out of all which we may define, that is to say determine, what that is, which is meant by this word reason, when we reckon it amongst the faculties of the mind. For reason, in this sense, is nothing but reckoning, that is, adding and subtracting, of the consequences of general names agreed upon, for the marking and signifying of our thoughts, I say marking them, when we reckon by ourselves, and signifying, when we demonstrate or approve our reckonings to other men. Right reason where. And as in arithmetic, unpracticed men must, and professors themselves may often err, and cast up false, so also in any other subject of reasoning, the ablest, most attentive, and most practiced men, may deceive themselves, and infer false conclusions, not but that reason itself is always right reason, as well as arithmetic is a certain and infallible art, but no one man's reason, nor the reason of any one number of men, makes the certainty, no more than an account is therefore well cast up, because a great many men have unanimously approved it. And therefore, as when there is a controversy in an account, the parties must by their own accord, set up for right reason, the reason of some arbitrator, or judge, to whose sentence they will both stand, or their controversy must either come to blows, or be undecided, for one of a right reason constituted by nature, so is it also in all debates of what kind soever, and when men that think themselves wiser than all others, clamor and demand right reason for judge, yet seek no more, but that things should be determined, by no other men's reason but their own, it is as intolerable in the society of men, as it is in play after trump is turned, to use for trump on every occasion, that sweet whereof they have most in their hand. For they do nothing else, that will have every of their passions, as it comes to bear sway in them, to be taken for right reason, and that in their own controversies, bewraying their want of right reason, by the claim they lay to it. The use of reason. The use and end of reason is not the finding of the sum and truth of one or a few consequences, remote from the first definitions and settled significations of names, but to begin at these, and proceed from one consequence to another. For there can be no certainty of the last conclusion, without a certainty of all those affirmations and negations, on which it was grounded, and inferred. As when a master of a family, in taking an account, casteth up the sums of all the bills of expense, into one sum, and not regarding how each bill is summed up, by those that give them in account, nor what it is he pays for, he advantages himself no more, than if he allowed the account in grossa, trusting to every of the accountant's skill and honesty. So also in reasoning of all other things, he that takes up conclusions on the trust of authors, and doth not fetch them from the first items in every reckoning, which are the significations of names settled by definitions, loses his labor, and does not know anything, but only believeth. Of error and of absurdity. When a man reckons without the use of words, which may be done in particular things, as when upon the sight of any one thing, we conjecture what was likely to have preceded, or is likely to follow upon it, if that which he thought likely to follow was not, or that which he thought likely to have preceded it, hath not preceded it, this is called error, to which even the most prudent men are subject. But when we reason in words of general signification, and fall upon a general inference which is false, though it be commonly called error, it is indeed an absurdity, or senseless speech. For error is but a deception, in presuming that somewhat is past, or to come, of which, though it were not past, or not to come, yet there was no impossibility discoverable. But when we make a general assertion, unless it be a true one, the possibility of it is unconceivable. And words whereby we conceive nothing but the sound, are those we call absurd, insignificant, and nonsense. And therefore if a man should talk to me of a round quadrangle, or accidents of bread and cheese, or immaterial substances, or of a free subject, a free will, or any free, but free from being hindered by opposition, I should not say he were in an error, but that his words were without meaning, that is to say, absurd. I have said before, in the second chapter, that a man did excel all other animals in this faculty, that when he conceived anything whatsoever, he was apt to inquire the consequences of it, and what effects he could do with it. And now I add to this other degree of the same excellence, that he can by words reduce the consequences he finds to general rules, called theorems, or aphorisma, that is, he can reason, or reckon, not only in number, but in all other things, whereof one may be added unto, or subtracted from another. But this privilege is allayed by another, and that is, by the privilege of absurdity, to which no living creature is subject, but man only. And of men, those are of all most subject to it, that profess philosophy. For it is most true that Cicero saith of them somewhere, that there can be nothing so absurd, but may be found in the books of philosophers. And the reason is manifest. For there is not one of them that begins his ratiocination from the definitions, or explications of the names they are to use, which is a method that hath been used only in geometry, whose conclusions have thereby been made indisputable. Causes of absurdity. The first cause of absurd conclusions I ascribe to the want of method, in that they begin not their ratiocination from definitions, that is, from settled significations of their words, as if they could cast account, without knowing the value of the numeral words, 1, 2, and 3. And whereas all bodies enter into account upon divers considerations, which I have mentioned in the precedent chapter, these considerations being diversely named, divers absurdities proceed from the confusion, and unfit connection of their names into assertions. And therefore, the second cause of absurd assertions, I ascribe to the giving of names of bodies, to accidents, or of accidents, to bodies, as they do, that say, faith is infused, or inspired, when nothing can be powered, or breathed into anything, but body, and that, extension is body, that phantasms are spirits, and the third I ascribe to the giving of the names of the accidents of bodies without us, to the accidents of our own bodies, as they do that say, the color is in the body, the sound is in the air, and the fourth, to the giving of the names of bodies, to names, or speeches, as they do that say, that there be things universal, that a living creature is genus, or a general thing, and the fifth, to the giving of the names of accidents, to names and speeches, as they do that say, the nature of a thing is in its definition, a man's command is his will, and the like. The sixth, to the use of metaphors, tropes, and other rhetorical figures, instead of words proper. For though it be lawful to say, for example, in common speech, the way goeth, or leadeth hither, or thither, the proverb says this or that, whereas ways cannot go, nor proverbs speak, yet in reckoning, and seeking of truth, such speeches are not to be admitted. The seventh, to names that signify nothing, but are taken up, and learned by rote from the schools, as hypostatical, transubstantiate, consubstantiate, eternal now, and the like canting of schoolmen. To him that can avoid these things, it is not easy to fall into any absurdity, unless it be by the length of an account, wherein he may perhaps forget what went before. For all men by nature reason alike, and well, when they have good principles. For who is so stupid, as both to mistake in geometry, and also to persist in it, when another detects his error to him? Science. By this it appears that reason is not as sense, and memory, born with us, nor gotten by experience only, as prudence is, but attained by industry, first in apt imposing of names, and secondly by getting a good and orderly method in proceeding from the elements, which are names, to assertions made by connection of one of them to another, and so to syllogisms, which are the connections of one assertion to another, till we come to a knowledge of all the consequences of names appertaining to the subject in hand, and that is it, men call science. And whereas sense and memory are but knowledge of fact, which is a thing past, and irrevocable, science is the knowledge of consequences, and dependence of one fact upon another, by which, out of that we can presently do, we know how to do something else when we will, or the like, another time, because when we see how anything comes about, upon what causes, and by what manner, when the like causes come into our power, we see how to make it produce the like effects. Children therefore are not endued with reason at all, till they have attained the use of speech, but are called reasonable creatures, for the possibility apparent of having the use of reason in time to come. And the most part of men, though they have the use of reasoning a little way, as in numbering to some degree, yet it serves them to little use in common life, in which they govern themselves, some better, some worse, according to their differences of experience, quickness of memory, and inclinations to several ends, but specially according to good or evil fortune, and the errors of one another. For as for science, or certain rules of their actions, they are so far from it, that they know not what it is. Geometry they have thought conjuring, but for other sciences, they who have not been taught the beginnings, and some progress in them, that they may see how they be acquired and generated, are in this point like children, that having no thought of generation, are made believe by the women, that their brothers and sisters are not born, but found in the garden. But yet they that have no science, are in better, and nobler condition with their natural prudence, than men, that by misreasoning, or by trusting them that reason wrong, fall upon false and absurd general rules. For ignorance of causes, and of rules, does not set men so far out of their way, as relying on false rules, and taking for causes of what they aspire to, those that are not so, but rather causes of the contrary. To conclude, the light of humane minds is perspicuous words, but by exact definitions first snuffed, and purged from ambiguity, reason is the pace, increase of science, the way, and the benefit of mankind, the end. And on the contrary, metaphors, and senseless and ambiguous words, are like ignis fatui, and reasoning upon them, is wandering amongst innumerable absurdities, and their end, contention and sedition, or contempt. Prudence and sapience, with their difference. As much experience is prudence, so is much science, sapience. For though we usually have one name of wisdom for them both, yet the Latines did always distinguish between prudentia and sapientia, ascribing the former to experience, the later to science. But to make their difference appear more clearly, let us suppose one man endued with an excellent natural use, and dexterity in handling his arma, and another to have added to that dexterity, an acquired science, of where he can offend, or be offended by his adversary, in every possible posture, or guard. The ability of the former, would be to the ability of the later, as prudence to sapience, both useful, but the later infallible. But they that trusting only to the authority of books, follow the blind blindly, are like him that trusting to the false rules of the master of fence, ventures presumptuously upon an adversary, that either kills, or disgraces him. Signa of science. The signa of science, are some, certain and infallible, some, uncertain. Certain, when he that pretendeth the science of anything, can teach the same, that is to say, demonstrate the truth thereof perspicuously to another. Uncertain, when only some particular events answer to his pretense, and upon many occasions prove so as he says they must. Signa of prudence are all uncertain, because to observe by experience, and remember all circumstances that may alter the success, is impossible. But in any business, whereof a man has not infallible science to proceed by, to forsake his own natural judgment, and be guided by general sentences read in authors, and subject to many exceptions, is a signa of folly and generally scorned by the name of pedantry. And even of those men themselves, that in councils of the Commonwealth, love to show their reading of politique and history, very few do it in their domestic affairs, where their particular interest is concerned, having prudence enough for their private affairs, but in public they study more the reputation of their own wit, than the success of another's business. Chapter 6. Of the inner eye or beginnings of voluntary motions commonly called the passions, and the speeches by which they are expressed. Motion vital and animal. There be in animals 2 sorts of motions peculiar to them, one called vital, begun in generation, and continued without interruption through their whole life, such as are the course of the blood, the pulse, the breathing, the concoctions, nutrition, excretion, and, to which motions there needs no help of imagination, the other in animal motion, otherwise called voluntary motion, as to go, to speak, to move any of our lamba, in such manner as is first fancied in our minds. That sense, is motion in the organs and inner eye or parts of man's body, caused by the action of the things we see, hear, and that fancy is but the relics of the same motion, remaining after sense, has been already cited in the first and second chapters. And because going, speaking, and the like voluntary motions, depend always upon a precedent thought of whither, which way, and what, it is evident, that the imagination is the first internal beginning of all voluntary motion. And although unstudied men do not conceive any motion at all to be there, where the thing moved is invisible, or the space it is moved in, is, for the shortness of it, insensible, yet that doth not hinder, but that such motions are. For let a space be never so little, that which is moved over a greater space, whereof that little one is part, must first be moved over that. These small beginnings of motion, within the body of man, before they appear in walking, speaking, striking, and other visible actions, are commonly called endeavor. Endeavor, appetite, desire, hunger, thirst, aversion. This endeavor, when it is toward something which causes it, is called appetite, or desire, the later, being the general name, and the other, oftentimes restrained to signify the desire of food, namely hunger and thirst. And when the endeavor is fromward something, it is generally called aversion. These words appetite and aversion we have from the Latines, and they both of them signify the motions, one of approaching, the other of retiring. So also do the Greek words for the same, which are orm and affirm. For nature itself does often press upon men those truths, which afterwards, when they look for somewhat beyond nature, they stumble at. For the schools find in mera appetite to go, or move, no actual motion at all, but because some motion they must acknowledge, they call it metaphorical motion, which is but an absurd speech, for though words may be called metaphorical, bodies and motions cannot. That which men desire, they are also side to love, and to hate those things, for which they have aversion. So that desire, and love, are the same thing, save that by desire, we always signify the absence of the object, by love, most commonly the presence of the same. So also by aversion, we signify the absence, and by hate, the presence of the object. Of appetites, and aversions, some are born with man, as appetite of food, appetite of excretion, and exoneration, which may also and more properly be called aversions, from somewhat they feel in their bodies, and some other appetites, not many. The rest, which are appetites of particular things, proceed from experience, and trial of their effects upon themselves, or other men. For of things we know not at all, or believe not to be, we can have no further desire, than to taste and try. But aversion we have for things, not only which we know have hurt us, but also that we do not know whether they will hurt us, or not. Contempt. Those things which we neither desire, nor hate, we are said to contemn, contempt being nothing else but an immobility, or contumacy of the heart, in resisting the action of certain things, and proceeding from that the heart is already moved otherwise, by either more potent objects, or from one of experience of them. And because the constitution of a man's body is in continual mutation, it is impossible that all the same things should always cause in him the same appetites, and aversions, much less can all men consent, in the desire of almost any one and the same object. Good of ill. But whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, that is it, which he for his part calleth good, and the object of his hate, and aversion, ill, and of his contempt, vile, and inconsiderable. For these words of good, ill, and contemptible, are ever used with relation to the person that useth them, there being nothing simply and absolutely so, nor any common rule of good and of ill, to be taken from the nature of the objects themselves, but from the person of the man, where there is no commonwealth, or, in a commonwealth, from the person that representeth it, or from an arbitrator or judge, whom men disagreeing shall by consent set up, and make his sentence the rule thereof. Pulchrum terpi, delightful, profitable, unpleasant, unprofitable. The Latine tongue has 2 words, whose significations approach to those of good and of ill, but are not precisely the same, and those are pulchrum and terpi. Whereof the former signifies that, which by some apparent signa promiseth good, and the later, that, which promiseth of ill. but in our tongue we have not so general names to express them by. But for pulchrum, we say in some things, fair, in other beautiful, or handsome, or gallant, or honorable, or comely, or amiable, and for turpy, full, deformed, ugly, base, nauseous, and the like, as the subject shall require, all which words, in their proper places signify nothing else, but the mind, or countenance, that promiseth good and evil. So that of good there be three kinds, good in the promise, that is pulchrum, good in effect, as the end desired, which is called jucundum, delightful, and good as the means, which is called util, profitable, and as many of evil, for evil, in promise, is that they call turpy, evil in effect, and end, is molestum, unpleasant, troublesome, and evil in the means, and util, unprofitable, hurtful. Delight displeasure. As, in sense, that which is really within us, is, as I have said before, only motion, caused by the action of external objects, but in appearance, to the sight, light and color, to the ear, sound, to the nostril, odor, and, so, when the action of the same object is continued from the eyes, ears, and other organs to the heart, the real effect there is nothing but motion, or endeavor, which consisteth in appetite, or aversion, to, or from the object moving. But the appearance, or sense of that motion, is that we either call delight, or trouble of mind. Pleasure offense. This motion, which is called appetite, and for the appearance of it delight and pleasure, seemeth to be a corroboration of vital motion, and a help thereunto, and therefore such things as cause delight, were not improperly called jucunda, adjuvando, from helping or fortifying, and the contrary, molesta, offensive from hindering and troubling the motion vital. Pleasure therefore, or delight, is the appearance, or sense of good, and molestation or displeasure, the appearance, or sense of evil. And consequently all appetite, desire, and love, is accompanied with some delight more or less and all hatred, and aversion, with more or less displeasure and offense. Pleasures of sense, pleasures of the mind, joy, pain, grief. Of pleasures, or delights, some arise from the sense of an object present, and those may be called pleasures of sense, the word sensual, as it is used by those only that condemn them, having no place till there be laws, of this kind are all onerations and exonerations of the body, as also all that is pleasant, and the sight, hearing, smell, taste, or touch. Others arise from the expectation, that proceeds from foresight of the end, or consequence of things, whether those things in the sense please or displease, and these are pleasures of the mind of him that draweth those consequences, and are generally called joy. In the like manner, displeasures, are some in the sense, and called pain, others, in the expectation of consequences, and are called grief. These simple passions called appetite, desire, love, aversion, hate, joy, and grief, have their names for divers considerations diversified. As first, when they one succeed another, they are diversely called from the opinion men have of the likelihood of attaining what they desire. Secondly, from the object loved or hated. Thirdly, from the consideration of many of them together. Fourthly, from the alteration or succession itself. Hope, for appetite with an opinion of attaining, is called hope. Despair, the same, without such opinion, despair. Fear, aversion, with opinion of hurt from the object, fear. Courage, the same, with hope of avoiding that hurt by resistance, courage. Anger, sudden courage, anger. Confidence, constant hope, confidence of ourselves. Diffidence, constant despair, diffidence of ourselves. Indignation, anger for great hurt done to another, when we conceive the same to be done by injury, indignation. Benevolence, desire of good to another, benevolence, goodwill, charity. If to man generally, good nature. Covetousness, desire of riches, covetousness, a name used always in signification of blame, because men contending for them, are displeased with one another's attaining them, though the desire in itself, be to be blamed, or allowed, according to the means by which those riches are sought. Ambition, desire of office, or precedence, ambition, a name used also in the worse sense, for the reason before mentioned. Pusillanimity, desire of things that conduce but a little to our ends, and fear of things that are but of little hindrance, pusillanimity. Magnanimity, contempt of little helps, and hindrances, magnanimity. Valor, magnanimity, in danger of death, or wounds, valor, fortitude. Liberality, magnanimity in the use of riches, liberality. Miserableness, pusillanimity, in the same wretchedness, miserableness, or parsimony, as it is liked or disliked. Kindness, love of persons for society, kindness. Natural lust, love of persons for pleasing the sense only, natural lust. Luxury, love of the same, acquired from rumination, that is imagination of pleasure past, luxury. The passion of love, jealousy, love of one singularly, with desire to be singularly beloved, the passion of love. The same, with fear that the love is not mutual, jealousy. Revengefulness, desire, by doing hurt to another, to make him condemn some fact of his own, revengefulness. Curiosity, desire, to know why and how, curiosity, such as is in no living creature but man, so that man is distinguished, not only by his reason, but also by this singular passion from other animals, in whom the appetite of food, and other pleasures of sense, by predominance, take away the care of knowing causes, which is a lust of the mind, that by a perseverance of delight in the continual and indefatigable generation of knowledge, exceedeth the short vehemence of any carnal pleasure. Religion, superstition, true religion, fear of power invisible, feigned by the mind, or imagined from tales publicly allowed, religion, not allowed, superstition. And when the power imagined is truly such as we imagine, true religion. Panicterror, fear, without the apprehension of why, or what, panic terror, called so from the fables that make Pan the author of them, whereas in truth there is always in him that so feareth, first, some apprehension of the cause, though the rest run away by example, every one supposing his fellow to know why. And therefore this passion happens to none but in a throng, or multitude of people. Admiration, joy, from apprehension of novelty, admiration, proper to man, because it excites the appetite of knowing the cause. Glory, vainglory, joy, arising from imagination of a man's own power and ability, is that exaltation of the mind which is called glorying, which, if grounded upon the experience of his own former actions, is the same with confidence, but if grounded on the flattery of others, or onely supposed by himself, for delight in the consequences of it, is called vainglory, which name is properly given, because a well-grounded confidence begetteth attempt, whereas the supposing of power does not, and is therefore rightly called vain. Dejection, grief, from opinion of one of power, is called dejection of mind. The vainglory which consisteth in the feigning or supposing of abilities in ourselves, which we know are not, is most incident to young men, and nourished by the histories or fictions of gallant persons, and is corrected oftentimes by age, and employment. Sudden glory, laughter, sudden glory, is the passion which maketh those grimaces called laughter, and is caused either by some sudden act of their own, that pleaseth them, or by the apprehension of some deformed thing in another, by comparison whereof they suddenly applaud themselves. And it is incident most to them, that are conscious of the fewest abilities in themselves, who are forced to keep themselves in their own favor, by observing the imperfections of other men. And therefore much laughter at the defects of others is a signa of pusillanimity. For of great minds, one of the proper works is to help and free others from scorn, and compare themselves only with the most able. Sudden dejection, weeping, on the contrary, sudden dejection is the passion that causeth weeping, and is caused by such accidents, as suddenly take away some vehement hope, or some prop of their power, and they are most subject to it, that rely principally on helps external, such as are women, and children. Therefore, some weep for the loss of friends, others for their unkindness, others for the sudden stop made to their thoughts of revenge, by reconciliation. But in all cases, both laughter and weeping, are sudden motions, custom taking them both away. For no man laughs at old jests, or weeps for an old calamity. Shame, blushing, grief, for the discovery of some defect of ability is shame, or the passion that discovereth itself in blushing, and consisteth in the apprehension of some thing dishonorable, and in young men, is a signa of the love of good reputation, and commendable, in old men it is a signa of the same, but because it comes too late, not commendable. Impudence, the contempt of good reputation is called impudence. Pity, grief, for the calamity of another is pity, and ariseth from the imagination that the like calamity may befall himself, and therefore is called also compassion, and in the phrase of this present time a fellow feeling, and therefore for calamity arriving from great wickedness, the best men have the least pity, and for the same calamity, those have least pity, that think themselves least obnoxious to the same. Cruelty, contempt, or little sense of the calamity of others, is that which men call cruelty, proceeding from security of their own fortune. For, that any man should take pleasure in other men's great harms, without other end of his own, I do not conceive it possible. Emulation, envy, grief, for the success of a competitor in wealth, honor, or other good, if it be joined with endeavor to enforce our own abilities to equal or exceed him, is called emulation, but joined with endeavor to supplant or hinder a competitor, envy. Deliberation, when in the mind of man, appetites and aversions, hopes and fears, concerning one and the same thing, arise alternately, and divers good and evil consequences of the doing, or omitting the thing propounded, come successively into our thoughts, so that sometimes we have an appetite to it, sometimes an aversion from it, sometimes hope to be able to do it, sometimes despair, or fear to attempt it, the whole sum of desires, aversions, hopes, and fears, continued till the thing be either done, or thought impossible, as that we call deliberation. Therefore of things past, there is no deliberation, because manifestly impossible to be changed, nor of things known to be impossible, or thought so, because men know, or think such deliberation vain. But of things impossible, which we think possible, we may deliberate, not knowing it is in vain. And it is called deliberation, because it is a putting an end to the liberty we had of doing, or omitting, according to our own appetite, or aversion. This alternate succession of appetites, aversions, hopes and fears is no less in other living creatures than in man, and therefore beasts also deliberate. Every deliberation is then side to end when that whereof they deliberate, is either done, or thought impossible, because till then we retain the liberty of doing, or omitting, according to our appetite, or aversion. The will. In deliberation, the last appetite, or aversion, immediately adhering to the action, or to the omission thereof, is that we call the will, the act, not the faculty, of willing. And beasts that have deliberation must necessarily also have will. The definition of the will, given commonly by the schools, that it is a rational appetite, is not good. For if it were, then could there be no voluntary act against reason. For a voluntary act is that, which proceedeth from the will, and no other. But if instead of a rational appetite, we shall say an appetite resulting from a precedent deliberation, then the definition is the same that I have given here. Will, therefore, is the last appetite in deliberating. And though we say in common discourse, a man had a will once to do a thing, that nevertheless he forbore to do, yet that is properly but an inclination, which makes no action voluntary, because the action depends not of it, but of the last inclination, or appetite. For if the intervenient appetites make any action voluntary, then by the same reason all intervenient aversions should make the same action involuntary, and so one and the same action should be both voluntary and involuntary. By this it is manifest, that not only actions that have their beginning from covetousness, ambition, lust, or other appetites to the thing propounded, but also those that have their beginning from aversion, or fear of those consequences that follow the omission, are voluntary actions. Forms of speech, in passion. The forms of speech by which the passions are expressed, are partly the same and partly different from those, by which we express our thoughts. And first generally all passions may be expressed indicatively, as, I love, I fear, I joy, I deliberate, I will, I command, but some of them have particular expressions by themselves, which nevertheless are not affirmations, unless it be when they serve to make other inferences, besides that of the passion they proceed from. Deliberation is expressed subjunctively, which is a speech proper to signify suppositions, with their consequences, as, if this be done, then this will follow, and differs not from the language of reasoning, save that reasoning is in general words, but deliberation for the most part is of particulars. The language of desire, and aversion, is imperative, as, do this, forbear that, which when the party is obliged to do, or forbear, is command, otherwise prayer, or els counsel. The language of vainglory, of indignation, pity, and revengefulness, optative, but of the desire to know, there is a peculiar expression called interrogative, as, what is it, when shall it, how is it done, and why so? Other language of the passions I find none, for cursing, swearing, reviling, and the like, do not signify as speech, but as the actions of a tongue accustomed. These forms of speech, I say, are expressions, or voluntary significations of our passions, but certain signa they be not, because they may be used arbitrarily, whether they that use them have such passions or not. The best signa of passions present are either in the countenance, motions of the body, actions, and ends, or aims, which we otherwise know the man to have. Good and evil apparent. And because in deliberation the appetites and aversions are raised by foresight of the good and evil consequences, and sequels of the action whereof we deliberate, the good or evil effect thereof dependeth on the foresight of a long chain of consequences, of which very seldom any man is able to see to the end. But for so far as a man seeth, if the good in those consequences be greater than the evil, the whole chain is that which writers call apparent or seeming good. And contrarily, when the evil exceedeth the good, the whole is apparent or seeming evil, so that he who hath by experience, or reason, the greatest and surest prospect of consequences, deliberates best himself, and is able, when he will, to give the best counsel unto others. Felicity. Continual success in obtaining those things which a man from time to time desireth, that is to say, continual prospering, is that men call felicity, I mean the felicity of this life. For there is no such thing as perpetual tranquility of mind, while we live here, because life itself is but motion, and can never be without desire, nor without fear, no more than without sense. What kind of felicity God hath ordained to them that devoutly honor him, a man shall no sooner know, than enjoy, being joys, that now are as incomprehensible, as the word of schoolman, beatifical vision, is unintelligible. Praise magnification. The form of speech whereby men signify their opinion of the goodness of anything is praise. That whereby they signify the power and greatness of anything is magnifying. And that whereby they signify the opinion they have of a man's felicity is by the Greeks called makarismos, for which we have no name in our tongue. And thus much is sufficient for the present purpose to have been said of the passions. Chapter 7. Of the ends or resolutions of discourse. Of all discourse, governed by desire of knowledge, there is at last an end, either by attaining, or by giving over. And in the chain of discourse, wheresoever it be interrupted, there is an end for that time. Judgment, or sentence final, doubt. If the discourse be merely mental, it consisteth of thoughts that the thing will be, and will not be, or that it has been, and has not been, alternately. So that wheresoever you break off the chain of a man's discourse, you leave him in a preassumption of it will be, or it will not be, or it has been, or has not been. All which is opinion. And that which is alternate appetite, in deliberating concerning good and evil, the same is alternate opinion in the inquiry of the truth of past, and future. And as the last appetite in deliberation is called the will, so the last opinion in search of the truth of past, and future, is called the judgment, or resolute and final sentence of him that discourseth. And as the whole chain of appetites alternate, in the question of good or bad is called deliberation, so the whole chain of opinions alternate, in the question of true or false is called doubt. No discourse whatsoever can end in absolute knowledge of fact, past, or to come. For, as for the knowledge of fact, it is originally sense, and ever after memory. And for the knowledge of consequence, which I have said before is called science, it is not absolute, but conditional. No man can know by discourse, that this, or that, is, has been, or will be, which is to know absolutely, but onely, that if this be, that is, if this has been, that has been, if this shall be, that shall be, which is to know conditionally, and that not the consequence of one thing to another, but of one name of a thing to another name of the same thing. Science, opinion, conscience. And therefore, when the discourse is put into speech, and begins with the definitions of words, and proceeds by connection of the same into general affirmations, and of these again into syllogisms, the end or last sum is called the conclusion, and the thought of the mind by it signified is that conditional knowledge, or knowledge of the consequence of words, which is commonly called science. But if the first ground of such discourse be not definitions, or if the definitions be not rightly joined together into syllogisms, then the end or conclusion is again opinion, namely of the truth of somewhat said, though sometimes in absurd and senseless words, without possibility of being understood. When two or more men know of one and the same fact, they are said to be conscious of it one to another, which is as much as to know it together. And because such are fittest witnesses of the facts of one another, or of a third, it was, and ever will be reputed a very evil act, for any man to speak against his conscience, or to corrupt or force another so to do, insomuch that the plea of conscience has been always hearkened unto very diligently in all times. Afterwards, men made use of the same word metaphorically, for the knowledge of their own secret facts, and secret thoughts, and therefore it is rhetorically said that the conscience is 1,000 witnesses. And last of all, men, vehemently in love with their own new opinions, though never so absurd, and obstinately bent to maintain them, gave those their opinions also that reverenced name of conscience, as if they would have it seem unlawful, to change or speak against them, and so pretend to know they are true, when they know at most but that they think so. Belief, faith. When a man's discourse beginneth not at definitions, it beginneth either at some other contemplation of his own, and then it is still called opinion, or it beginneth at some saying of another, of whose ability to know the truth, and of whose honesty in not deceiving, he doubteth not, and then the discourse is not so much concerning the thing, as the person, and the resolution is called belief, and faith, in the man, belief, both of the man, and of the truth of what he says. So then in belief are two opinions, one of the saying of the man, the other of his virtue. To have faith in, or trust to, or believe a man, signify the same thing, namely, an opinion of the veracity of the man, but to believe what is said, signifieth only an opinion of the truth of the saying. But we are to observe that this phrase, I believe in, as also the Latine, credo in, and the Greek, pistonois, are never used but in the writings of divines. Instead of them, in other writings are put, I believe him, I have faith in him, I rely on him, and in Latin, fido illi, and in Greek, pistonoanto, and that this singularity of the ecclesiastical use of the word hath raised many disputes about the right object of the Christian faith. But by believing in, as it is in the Creed, is meant, not trust in the person, but confession and acknowledgement of the doctrine. For not only Christians, but all manner of men do so believe in God, as to hold all for truth they hear him say, whether they understand it, or not, which is all the faith and trust can possibly be had in any person whatsoever, but they do not all believe the doctrine of the Creed. From whence we may infer, that when we believe any saying whatsoever it be, to be true, from arguments taken not from the thing itself, or from the principles of natural reason, but from the authority, and good opinion we have, of him that hath said it, then is the speaker, or person we believe in, or trust in, and whose word we take, the object of our faith, and the honor done in believing, is done to him only. And consequently, when we believe that the Scriptures are the word of God, having no immediate revelation from God himself, our belief, faith, and trust is in the Church, whose word we take, and acquiesce therein. And they that believe that which a prophet relates unto them in the name of God, take the word of the prophet, do honor to him, and in him trust, and believe, touching the truth of what he relateth, whether he be a true, or a false prophet. And so it is also with all other history. For if I should not believe all that is written by historians, of the glorious acts of Alexander, or Caesar, I do not think the ghost of Alexander, or Caesar, had any just cause to be offended, or anybody else, but the historian. If Livy say the gods made once a cow speak, and we believe it not, we distrust not God therein, but Livy. So that it is evident, that whatsoever we believe, upon no other reason, than what is drawn from authority of men only and their writings, whether they be sent from God or not, is faith in men only. Chapter 8. Of the virtues commonly called intellectual, and their contrary defects. Intellectual virtue defined. Virtue generally, in all sorts of subjects, is somewhat that is valued for eminence, and consisteth in comparison. For if all things were equally in all men, nothing would be prized. And by virtues intellectual, are always understood such abilities of the mind, as men praise, value, and desire should be in themselves, and go commonly under the name of a good wit, though the same word wit be used also, to distinguish one certain ability from the rest. Wit, natural, or acquired. These virtues are of two sorts, natural and acquired. By natural, I mean not that which a man hath from his birth, for that is nothing else but sense, wherein men differ so little one from another and from brute beasts, as it is not to be reckoned amongst virtues. But I mean, that wit, which is gotten by use only, and experience, without method, culture, or instruction. This natural wit consisteth principally in two things, celerity of imagining, that is, swift succession of one thought to another, and steady direction to some approved end. On the contrary, a slow imagination maketh that defect, or fault of the mind, which is commonly called dullness, stupidity, and sometimes by other names that signify slowness of motion, or difficulty to be moved. Good wit, or fancy, good judgment, discretion. And this difference of quickness is caused by the difference of men's passions, that love and dislike, some one thing, some another, and therefore some men's thoughts run one way, some another, and are held to, and observe differently the things that pass through their imagination. And whereas in his succession of men's thoughts, there is nothing to observe in the things they think on, but either in what they be like one another, or in what they be unlike, or what they serve for, or how they serve to such a purpose, those that observe their similitudes, in case they be such as are but rarely observed by others, are said to have a good wit, by which, in this occasion, is meant a good fancy. But they that observe their differences and dissimilitudes, which is called distinguishing, and discerning, and judging between thing and thing, in case such discerning be not easy, are said to have a good judgment, and particularly in matter of conversation and business, wherein times, places, and persons are to be discerned, this virtue is called discretion. The former, that is, fancy, without the help of judgment, is not commended as a virtue, but the later, which is judgment, and discretion, is commended for itself, without the help of fancy. Besides the discretion of times, places, and persons, necessary to a good fancy, there is required also an often application of his thoughts to their end, that is to say, to some use to be made of them. This done, he that hath this virtue, will be easily fitted with similitudes, that will please, not only by illustration of his discourse, and adorning it with new and apt metaphors, but also by the rarity or their invention. But without steadiness, and direction to some end, a great fancy is one kind of madness, such as they have, that entering into any discourse, are snatched from their purpose, by everything that comes in their thought, into so many, and so long digressions, and parentheses, that they utterly lose themselves, which kind of folly, I know no particular name for, but the cause of it is, sometimes one of experience, whereby that seemeth to a man new and rare, which doth not so to others, sometimes pusillanimity, by which that seems great to him, which other men think a trifle, and whatsoever is new, or great and therefore thought fit to be told, withdraws a man by degrees from the intended way of his discourse. In a good poem, whether it be epique, or dramatique, as also in sonnets, epigrams, and other pieces, both judgment and fancy are required, but the fancy must be more eminent, because they please for the extravagancy, but ought not to displease by indiscretion. In a good history, the judgment must be eminent, because the goodness consisteth, in the method, in the truth, and in the quise of the actions that are most profitable to be known. Fancy has no place, but only in adorning the style. In orations of praise, and in invectives, the fancy is predominant, because the design is not truth, but to honor or dishonor, which is done by noble or by vile comparisons. The judgment does but suggest what circumstances make an action laudable or culpable. In hortatives and pleadings, as truth, or disguise serveth best to the design in hand, so is the judgment, or the fancy most required. In demonstration, in counsel, and all rigorous search of truth, judgment does all, except sometimes the understanding have need to be opened by some apt similitude, and then there is so much use of fancy. But for metaphors, they are in this case utterly excluded. For seeing they openly profess deceit, to admit them into counsel, or reasoning, were manifest folly. And in any discourse whatsoever, if the defect of discretion be apparent, how extravagant soever the fancy be, the whole discourse will be taken for a signo of want of wit, and so will it never when the discretion is manifest, though the fancy be never so ordinary. The secret thoughts of a man run over all things, holy, profane, clean, obscene, grave, and light, without shame, or blame, which for bald discourse cannot do, farther than the judgment shall approve of the time, place, and persons. An anatomist, or a physician may speak, or write his judgment of unclean things, because it is not to please, but profit, but for another man to write his extravagant, and pleasant fancies of the same, is as if a man, from being tumbled into the dirt, should come and present himself before good company. And 'tis the want of discretion that makes the difference. Again, in professed remissness of mind, and familiar company, a man may play with the sounds, and equivocal significations of words, and that many times with encounters of extraordinary fancy, but in a sermon, or in public, or before persons unknown, or whom we ought to reverence, there is no gingling of words that will not be accounted folly, and the difference is only in the want of discretion. So that where wit is wanting, it is not fancy that is wanting, but discretion. Judgment therefore without fancy is wit, but fancy without judgment not. Prudence. When the thoughts of a man, that has a design in hand, running over a multitude of things, observes how they conduce to that design, or what design they may conduce into, if his observations be such as are not easy, or usual, this wit of his is called prudence, and dependeth on much experience, and memory of the like things, and their consequences heretofore. In which there is not so much difference of men, as there is in their fancies and judgments, because the experience of men equal in age, is not much unequal, as to the quantity, but lies in different occasions, every one having his private designs. To govern well a family and a kingdom, are not different degrees of prudence, but different sorts of business, no more than to draw a picture in little, or as great, or greater than the life, are different degrees of art. A plain husbandman is more prudent in affairs of his own house, than a privy counsellor in the affairs of another man. Craft. To prudence, if you ought of the use of unjust, or dishonest means, such as usually are prompted to men by fear, or want, you have that crooked wisdom, which is called craft, which is a signa of pusillanimity. For magnanimity is contempt of unjust, or dishonest helps. And that which the Latines call versutia, translated into English, shifting, and is a putting off of a present danger or incommodity, by engaging into a greater, as when a man robs one to pay another, is but a shorter-sighted craft, called versutia, from versura, which signifies taking money at usury, for the present payment of interest. Acquired wit. As for acquired wit, I mean acquired by method and instruction, there is none but reason, which is grounded on the right use of speech, and produceth the sciences. But of reason and science, I have already spoken in the 5th and 6th chapters. The causes of this difference of wits, are in the passions, and the difference of passions, proceedeth partly from the different constitution of the body, and partly from different education. For if the difference proceeded from the temper of the brain, and the organs of sense, either exterior or interior, there would be no less a difference of men in their sight, hearing, or other senses, than in their fancies, and discretions. It proceeds therefore from the passions, which are different, not only from the difference of men's complexions, but also from their difference of customs, and education. The passions that most of all cause the differences of wit, are principally, the more or less a desire of power, of riches, of knowledge, and of honor. All which may be reduced to the first, that is desire of power. For riches, knowledge and honor are but several sorts of power. Giddiness, madness. And therefore, a man who has no great passion for any of these things, but is as men term it indifferent, though he may be so far a good man, as to be free from giving offense, yet he cannot possibly have either a great fancy, or much judgment. For the thoughts, are to the desires, as scouts, and spies, to range abroad, and find the way to the things desired, all steadiness of the mind's motion, and all quickness of the same, proceeding from thence. For as to have no desire, is to be dead, so to have weak passions, is dullness, and to have passions indifferently for everything, giddiness, and distraction, and to have stronger, and more vehement passions for anything, than is ordinarily seen in others, is that which men call madness. Whereof there be almost as many kinds, as of the passions themselves. Sometimes the extraordinary and extravagant passion, proceedeth from the evil constitution of the organs of the body, or harm done them, and sometimes the hurt, and indisposition of the organs, is caused by the vehemence, or long continuance of the passion. But in both cases the madness is of one and the same nature. The passion, whose violence, or continuance maketh madness, is either great vainglory, which is commonly called pride, and self-conceit, or a great dejection of mind. Rage. Pride subjecteth a man to anger, the excess whereof, is the madness called rage, and fury. And thus it comes to pass that excessive desire of revenge, when it becomes habitual, hurteth the organs, and becomes rage, that excessive love, with jealousy, becomes also rage, excessive opinion of a man's own self, for divine inspiration, for wisdom, learning, form, and the like, becomes distraction, and giddiness, the same, joined with envy, rage, vehement opinion of the truth of anything, contradicted by others, rage. Melancholy. Dejection, subjects a man to causeless fears, which is a madness commonly called melancholy, apparent also in divers manners, as in haunting of solitudes, and graves, in superstitious behavior, and in fearing some another particular thing. In sum, all passions that produce strange and unusual behavior, are called by the general name of madness. But of the several kinds of madness, he that would take the pains, might enroll a legion. And if the excesses be madness, there is no doubt but the passions themselves, when they tend to evil, are degrees of the same. For example, though the effect of folly, in them that are possessed of an opinion of being inspired, be not visible always in one man, by any very extravagant action, that proceedeth from such passion, yet when many of them conspire together, the rage of the whole multitude is visible enough. For what argument of madness can there be greater, than to clamor, strike, and throw stones at our best friends? Yet this is somewhat less than such a multitude will do. For they will clamor, fight against, and destroy those, by whom all their lifetime before, they have been protected, and secured from injury. And if this be madness in the multitude, it is the same in every particular man. For as in the midst of the sea, though a man perceive no sound of that part of the water next him, yet he is well assured, that part contributes as much, to the roaring of the sea, as any other part, of the same quantity, so also, thought we perceive no great unquietness, in one, or two men, yet we may be well assured, that their singular passions, are parts of the seditious roaring of a troubled nation. And if there were nothing else that bewrayed their madness, yet that very arrogating such inspiration to themselves, is argument enough. If some man in Bedlam should entertain you with sober discourse, and you desire in taking leave, to know what he were, that you might another time requite his civility, and he should tell you, he were God the Father, I think you need expect no extravagant action for argument of his madness. This opinion of inspiration, called commonly, private spirit, begins very often, from some lucky finding of an error generally held by others, and not knowing, or not remembering, by what conduct of reason, they came to so singular a truth, as they think it, though it be many times an untruth they light on, they presently admire themselves, as being in the special grace of God Almighty, who hath revealed the same to them supernaturally, by his Spirit. Again, that madness is nothing else, but too much appearing passion, may be gathered out of the effects of wine, which are the same with those of the evil disposition of the organs. For the variety of behavior in men that have drunk too much, is the same with that of madmen, some of them raging, others loving, others laughing, all extravagantly, but according to their several domineering passions, for the effect of the wine does but remove dissimulation, and take from them the sight of the deformity of their passions. For, I believe, the most sober men, when they walk alone without care and employment of the mind, would be unwilling the vanity and extravagance of their thoughts at that time should be publicly seen, which is a confession, that passions unguided, are for the most part mere madness. The opinions of the world, both antient and later ages, concerning the cause of madness, have been two. Some, deriving them from the passions, some from demons, or spirits, either good or bad, which they thought might enter into a man, possess him, and move his organs in such strange and uncouth manner, as madmen used to do. The former sort therefore, called such men, madmen, but the later, called them sometimes demoniacs, that is, possessed with spirits, sometimes energumeni, that is agitated, or moved with spirits, and now in Italy they are called not only pazzi, madmen, but also spiritati, men possessed. There was once a great conflux of people in Abdera, a city of the Greeks, at the acting of the tragedy of Andromeda, upon an extreme hot day, whereupon, a great many of the spectators falling into fevers, had this accident from the heat, and from the tragedy together, that they did nothing but pronounce iambics, with the names of Perseus and Andromeda, which together with the fever, was cured, by the coming on of winter, and this madness was thought to proceed from the passion imprinted by the tragedy. Likewise there reigned a fit of madness in another Grecian city, which seized only the young maidens, and caused many of them to hang themselves. This was by most then thought an act of the devil. But one that suspected, that contempt of life in them might proceed from some passion of the mind, and supposing they did not contemn also their honor, gave counsel to the magistrates, to strip such as so hang themselves, and let them hang out naked. This the story says cured that madness. But on the other side, the same Graecians, did often ascribe madness, to the operation of the Eumenides, or Furies, and sometimes of Ceres, Phoebus, and other gods, so much did men attribute to phantasms, as to think them aerial living bodies, and generally to call them spirits. And as the Romans in this, held the same opinion with the Greeks, so also did the Jews, for they cae madmen prophets, or, according as they thought the spirits good or bad, demoniacs, and some of them called both prophets, and demoniacs, madmen, and some called the same man both demoniac, and madman. But for the Gentiles, 'tis no wonder, because diseases, and health, vices, and virtues, and many natural accidents, were with them termed, and worshipped as demons. So that a man was to understand by demon, as well, sometimes, an ague, as a divel. But for the Jews to have such opinion, is somewhat strange. For neither Moses, nor Abraham pretended to prophecy by possession of a spirit, but from the voice of God, or by a vision or dream, nor is there anything in his law, moral, or ceremonial, by which they were taught, there was any such enthusiasm, or any possession. When God aside, Num. 11:25, to take from the spirit that was in Moses, and give it to the 70 elders, the Spirit of God, taking it for the substance of God, is not divided. The Scriptures by the Spirit of God in man, mean a man's spirit, inclined to godliness. And where it is said, Exod. 28:3, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom to make garments for Aaron, is not meant a spirit put into them, that can make garments, but the wisdom of their own spirits in the kind of work. In the like sense, the spirit of man, when it produceth unclean actions, is ordinarily called an unclean spirit, and so other spirits, though not always, yet as often as the virtue or vice so styled, is extraordinary and eminent. Neither did the other prophets of the Old Testament pretend enthusiasm, or that God spake in them, but to them by voice, vision, or dream, and the burthen of the Lord was not possession, but command. How then could the Jews fall into this opinion of possession? I can imagine no reason, but that which is common to all men, namely, the one of curiosity to search natural causes, and their placing felicity, in the acquisition of the grosser pleasures of the senses, and the things that most immediately conduce thereto. For they that see any strange, and unusual ability, or defect in a man's mind, unless they see withal from what cause it may probably proceed, can hardly think it natural, and if not natural, they must needs think it supernatural, and then what can it be, but that either God, or the divel is in him? And hence it came to pass, when our Saviour, Mark 3:21, was compassed about with the multitude, those of the house doubted he was mad, and went out to hold him, but the scribes said he had Beelzebub, and that was it, by which he cast out divels, as if the greater madman had awed the lesser. And that, John 10:20, some said, he hath a divel, and is mad, whereas others holding him for a prophet, sighed, these are not the words of one that hath a divel. So in the Old Testament he that came to anoint Jehu, 2 Kings 9.11, was a prophet, but some of the company asked Jehu, what came that madman for? So that in sum, it is manifest, that whosoever behaved himself in extraordinary manner, was thought by the Jews to be possessed either with a good or a vil spirit, except by the Sadducees, who erred so far on the other hand, as not to believe there were at all any spirits, which is very near to direct atheism, and thereby perhaps the more provoked others, to term such men demoniacs, rather than madmen. But why then does our Saviour proceed in the curing of them, as if they were possessed, and not as if they were mad? To which I can give no other kind of answer, but that which is given to those that urge the Scripture in like manner against the opinion of the motion of the earth. The Scripture was written to show unto men the kingdom of God, and to prepare their minds to become his obedient subjects, leaving the world, and the philosophy thereof, to the disputation of men, for the exercising of their natural reason. Whether the earth's, or sun's motion make the day, and night, or whether the exorbitant actions of men, proceed from passion, or from the divel, so we worship him not, it is all one, as to our obedience, and subjection to God Almighty, which is the thing for which the Scripture was written. As for that our Saviour speaketh to the disease, as to a person, it is the usual phrase of all that cure by words only, as Christ did, and enchanters pretend to do, whether they speak to a divil or not, for is not Christ also said, Math. 8.26, to have rebuked the winds? Is not he said also Luke 4:39, to rebuke a fever? Yet this does not argue that a fever is a divil. And whereas many of these divils are said to confess Christ, it is not necessary to interpret those places otherwise, than that those madmen confessed him. And whereas our Saviour, Math. 12:43, speaketh of an unclean spirit, that having gone out of a man, wandereth through dry places, seeking rest, and finding none, and returning into the same man, with 7 other spirits worse than himself, it is manifestly a parable, alluding to a man, that after a little endeavor to quit his lusts, is vanquished by the strength of them, and becomes 7 times worse than he was. So that I see nothing at all in the Scripture, that requireth a belief, that demoniacs were any other thing but madmen. Insignificant speech. There is yet another fault in the discourses of some men, which may also be numbered amongst the sorts of madness, namely, that abuse of words, whereof I have spoken before in the 5th chapter, by the name of absurdity. And that is, when men speak such words, as put together, have in them no signification at all, but are fallen upon by some, through misunderstanding of the words they have received, and repeat by rote, by others, from intention to deceive by obscurity. And this is incident to none but those, that converse in questions of matters incomprehensible, as the schoolmen, or in questions of abstruse philosophy. The common sort of men seldom speak insignificantly, and are therefore, by those other egregious persons counted idiots. But to be assured their words are without anything correspondent to them in the mind, there would need some examples, which if any man require, let him take a schoolman into his hands and see if he can translate any one chapter concerning any difficult point, as the Trinity, the Deity, the nature of Christ, transubstantiation, free will, and into any of the modern tongues, so as to make the same intelligible, or into any tolerable Latine, such as they were acquainted withal, that lived when the Latine tongue was vulgar. What is the meaning of these words? The first cause does not necessarily inflow anything into the second, by force of the essential subordination of the second causes, by which it may help it to work. They are the translation of the title of the 6th chapter of Suarez' first book, of the concourse, motion, and help of God. When men write whole volumes of such stuff, are they not mad, or intend to make others so? And particularly, in the question of transubstantiation, where after certain words spoken, they that say, the whiteness, roundness, magnitude, quality, corruptibility, all which are incorporeal, and go out of the wafer, into the body of our blessed Saviour, do they not make those nesesh, tudes, and ties, to be so many spirits possessing his body? For by spirits, they mean always things, that being incorporeal, are nevertheless movable from one place to another. So that this kind of absurdity, may rightly be numbered amongst the many sorts of madness, and all the time that guided by clear thoughts of their worldly lust, they forbear disputing, or writing thus, but lucide intervals. And thus much of the virtues and defects intellectual. Chapter 9. Of the several subjects of knowledge. There are of knowledge 2 kinds, whereof one is knowledge of fact, the other knowledge of the consequence of one affirmation to another. The former is nothing else, but sense and memory, and is absolute knowledge, as when we see a fact doing, or remember it done, and this is the knowledge required in a witness. The later is called science, and is conditional, as when we know, that, if the figure shown be a circle, then any straight line through the center shall divide it into two equal parts. And this is the knowledge required in a philosopher, that is to say, of him that pretends to reasoning. The register of knowledge of fact is called history. Whereof there be two sorts, one called natural history, which is the history of such facts, or effects of nature, as have no dependence on man's will, such as are the histories of metals, plants, animals, regions, and the like. The other is civil history, which is the history of the voluntary actions of men and commonwealths. The registers of science are such books as contain the demonstrations of consequences of one affirmation to another, and are commonly called books of philosophy, whereof the sorts are many, according to the diversity of the matter, and may be divided in such manner as I have divided them in the following table. A science, that is, knowledge of consequences, which is called also philosophy. A consequences from accidents of bodies natural, which is called natural philosophy. 1. Consequences from the accidents common to all bodies natural, which are quantity and motion. A. Consequences from quantity and motion indeterminate, which, being the principles or first foundation of philosophy, is called philosophia prima. Philosophia prima. B. Consequences from motion and quantity determined. 1. Consequences from quantity and motion determined. A. By figure, by number. 1. Mathematiques. Geometry. Arithmetic. 2. Consequences from the motion and quantity of bodies n. Special. A. Consequences from the motion and quantity of the great parts of the world, as the earth and stars. 1. Cosmography. Astronomy. Geography. B. Consequences from the motion of special kinds, and figures of body. 1. Mechaniques, doctrine of weight. Science of engineers. Architecture. Navigation. 2. Physiques, or consequences from qualities. A. Consequences from the qualities of bodies transient, such as sometimes appear, sometimes vanish. Meteorology. B. Consequences from the qualities of bodies permanent. 1. Consequences from the qualities of the stars. A. Consequences from the light of the stars. Out of this, and the motion of the sunna, is made the science of seography. B. Consequences from the influence of the stars. Astrology. 2. Consequences of the qualities from liquid bodies that fill the space between the stars, such as are the air, or substance ethereal. 3. Consequences from qualities of bodies terrestrial. A. Consequences from parts of the earth that are without sense. 1. Consequences from qualities of minerals, as stones, metals, and 2. Consequences from the qualities of vegetables. B. Consequences from qualities of animals. 1. Consequences from qualities of animals in general. A. Consequences from vision. Optique. B. Consequences from sounds. Musique. C. Consequences from the rest of the senses. 2. Consequences from qualities of men and special. A. Consequences from passions of men. Ethics. B. Consequences from speech. I. In magnifying, vilifying, etc. Poetry. 2. In persuading. Rhetorique. 3. In reasoning. Logique. 4. In contracting. The science of just and unjust. B. Consequences from the accidents of politique bodies, which is called politique and civil philosophy. 1. Of consequences from the institution of commonwealths. 2. The rights and duties of the body politique, or sovereign. 2. Of consequences from the same, to the duty and right of the subjects. Chapter 10. Of power, worth, dignity, honor and worthiness. Power. The power of a man, to take it universally, is his present means, to obtain some future apparent good. And is either original, or instrumental. Natural power, is the eminence of the faculties of body, or mind, as extraordinary strength, form, prudence, arts, eloquence, liberality, nobility. Instrumental are those powers, which acquired by these, or by fortune, are means and instruments to acquire more, as riches, reputation, friends, and the secret working of God, which men call good luck. For the nature of power, is in this point, like to fame, increasing as it proceeds, or like the motion of heavy bodies, which the further they go, make still the more hast. The greatest of humane powers, is that which is compounded of the powers of most men, united by consent, in one person, natural, or civil, that has the use of all their powers depending on his will, such as is the power of a commonwealth, or depending on the wills of each particular, such as is the power of a faction, or of divers factions league. Therefore to have servants, is power, to have friends, is power, for they are strengths united. Also riches joined with liberality, is power, because it procureth friends, and servants. Without liberality, not so, because in this case they defend not, but expose men to envy, as a prey. Reputation of power, is power, because it draweth with it the adherence of those that need protection. So is reputation of love of a man's country, called popularity, for the same reason. Also, what quality soever maketh a man beloved, or feared of many, or the reputation of such quality, is power, because it is a means to have the assistance, and service of many. Good success is power, because it maketh reputation of wisdom, or good fortune, which makes men either fear him, or rely on him. Affability of men already in power, is increase of power, because it gaineth love. Reputation of prudence in the conduct of peace or war, is power, because to prudent men, we commit the government of ourselves, more willingly than to others. Nobility is power, not in all places, but only in those commonwealths, where it has privileges, for in such privileges consisteth their power. Eloquence is power, because it is seeming prudence. Form is power, because being a promise of good, it recommendeth men to the favor of women and strangers. The sciences, are small power, because not eminent, and therefore, not acknowledged in any man, nor are at all, but in a few, and in them, but of a few things. For science is of that nature, as none can understand it to be, but such as in a good measure have attained it. Arts of public use, as fortification, making of engines, and other instruments of war, because they confer to defense, and victory, are power, and though the true mother of them, be science, namely the mathematiques, yet, because they are brought into the light, by the hand of the artificer, they be esteemed, the midwife passing with the vulgar for the mother, as his issue. Worth. The value, or worth of a man, is as of all other things, his price, that is to say, so much as would be given for the use of his power, and therefore is not absolute, but a thing dependent on the need and judgment of another. An able conductor of soldiers, is of great price in time of war present, or imminent, but in peace not so. A learned and uncorrupt judge, is much worth in time of peace, but not so much in war. And as in other things, so in men, not the seller, but the buyer determines the price. For let a man, as most men do, rate themselves as the highest value they can, yet their true value is no more than it is esteemed by others. The manifestation of the value we set on one another, is that which is commonly called honoring, and dishonoring. To value a man at a high rate, is to honor him, at a low rate, is to dishonor him. But high, and low, in this case, is to be understood by comparison to the rate that each man setteth on himself. Dignity. The public worth of a man, which is the value set on him by the Commonwealth, is that which men commonly call dignity. And this value of him by the Commonwealth, is understood, by offices of command, judicature, public employment, or by names and titles, introduced for distinction of such value. To honor and dishonor. To pray to another, for aid of any kind, is to honor, because a signa we have an opinion he has power to help, and the more difficult the aid is, the more is the honor. To obey is to honor, because no man obeys them, whom they think have no power to help, or hurt them. And consequently to disobey, is to dishonor. To give great gifts to a man, is to honor him, because 'tis buying of protection, and acknowledging of power. To give little gifts, is to dishonor, because it is but alms, and signifies an opinion of the need of small helps. To be sedulous in promoting another's good, also to flatter, is to honor, as a signa we seek his protection or aid. To neglect, is to dishonor. To give way, or place to another, in any commodity, is to honor, being a confession of greater power. To arrogate, is to dishonor. To show any signa of love, or fear of another, is to honor, for both to love, and to fear, is to value. To contemn, or less to love or fear than he expects, is to dishonor, for 'tis undervaluing. To praise, magnify, or call happy, is to honor, because nothing but goodness, power, and felicity is valued. To revile, mock, or pity, is to dishonor. To speak to another with consideration, to appear before him with decency, and humility, is to honor him, as signa of fear to offend. To speak to him rashly, to do anything before him obscenely, slovenly, impudently, is to dishonor. To believe, to trust, to rely on another, is to honor him, signa of opinion of his virtue and power. To distrust, or not believe, is to dishonor. To hearken to a man's counsel, or discourse of what kind soever, is to honor, as a signa we think him wise, or eloquent, or witty. To sleep, or go forth, or talk the while, is to dishonor. To do those things to another, which he takes for signa of honor, or which the law or custom makes so, is to honor, because in approving the honor done by others, he acknowledgeth the power which others acknowledge. To refuse to do them, is to dishonor. To agree with an opinion, is to honor, as being a signa of approving his judgment, and wisdom. To dissent, is dishonor, and an upbraiding of error, and, if the dissent be in many things, of folly. To imitate, is to honor, for it is vehemently to approve. To imitate one's enemy, is to dishonor. To honor those another honors, is to honor him, as a signa of approbation of his judgment. To honor his enemies, is to dishonor him. To employ in counsel, or actions of difficulty, is to honor, as a signa of opinion of his wisdom, or other power. To deny employment in the same cases, to those that seek it, is to dishonor. All these ways of honoring, are natural, and as well within, as without commonwealths. But in commonwealths, where he, or they that have the supreme authority, can make whatsoever they please, to stand for signa of honor, there be other honors. A sovereign doth honor a subject, with whatsoever title, or office, or employment, or action, that he himself will have taken for a signa of his will to honor him. The king of Persia honored Mordecai, when he appointed he should be conducted through the streets in the king's garment, upon one of the king's horses, with a crown on his head, and a prince before him, proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done to him that the king will honor." And yet another king of Persia, or the same another time, to one that demanded for some great service, to wear one of the king's robes, gave him leave so to do, but with his addition, that he should wear it as the king's fool, and then it was dishonor. So that of civil honor, such as our magistracy, offices, titles, and in some places coats, and scutcheons painted, and men honor such as have them, as having so many signa of favor in the commonwealth, which favor is power. Honorable is whatsoever possession, action, or quality, is an argument and signa of power. And therefore to be honored, loved, or feared of many, is honorable, as arguments of power. To be honored of few or none, dishonorable. Good fortune, if lasting, honorable, as a signa of the favor of God. Ill fortune, and losses, dishonorable. Riches, are honorable, for they are power. Poverty, dishonorable. Magnanimity, liberality, hope, courage, confidence, are honorable, for they proceed from the conscience of power. Pusillanimity, parsimony, fear, diffidence, are dishonorable. Timely resolution, or determination of what a man is to do, is honorable, as being the contempt of small difficulties, and dangers. And irresolution, dishonorable, as a signa of too much valuing of little impediments, and little advantages, for when a man has weighed things as long as the time permits, and resolves not, the difference of weight is but little, and therefore if he resolve not, he overvalues little things, which is pusillanimity. All actions, and speeches, that proceed, or seem to proceed from much experience, science, discretion, or wit, are honorable, for all these are powers. Actions, or words that proceed from error, ignorance, or folly, dishonorable. Gravity, as far forth as it seems to proceed from a mind employed on something else, is honorable, because employment is a signa of power. But if it seem to proceed from a purpose to appear grave, it is dishonorable. For the gravity of the former, is like the steadiness of a ship laden with merchandise, but of the later, like the steadiness of a ship ballasted with sand, and other trash. To be conspicuous, that is to say, to be known, for wealth, office, great actions, or any eminent good, is honorable, as a sign of the power for which he is conspicuous. On the contrary, obscurity is dishonorable. To be descended from conspicuous parents is honorable, because they the more easily attain the ides and friends of their ancestors. On the contrary, to be descended from obscure parentage is dishonorable. Actions proceeding from equity, joined with lossy, are honorable, as signa of magnanimity, for magnanimity is a signa of power. On the contrary, craft, shifting, neglect of equity, is dishonorable. Nor does it alter the case of honor, whether in action, so it be great and difficult, and consequently a signa of much power, be just or unjust, for honor consisteth only in the opinion of power. Therefore the ancient heathen did not think he they dishonored, but greatly honored the gods, when they introduced them in their poems, committing rapes, thefts, and other great but unjust, or unclean acts, insomuch as nothing is so much celebrated in Jupiter, as his adulteries, nor in Mercury, as his frauds, and thefts, of whose praises, in a hymn of Homer, the greatest is this, that being born in the morning, he had invented music at noon, and before night, stolen away the cattle of Apollo, from his herdsmen. Also amongst men, till there were constituted great commonwealths, it was thought no dishonor to be a pirate, or a highway thief, but rather a lawful trade, not only amongst the Greeks, but also amongst all other nations, as is manifest by the histories of antient time. And at this day, in this part of the world, private duels are, and always will be honorable, though unlawful, till such time as there shall be honor ordained for them that refuse, and ignominy for them that make the challenge. For duels also are many times effects of courage, and the ground of courage is always strength or skill, which are power, though for the most part they be effects of rash speaking, and of the fear of dishonor, in one, or both the combatants, who engaged by rashness, are driven into the list to avoid disgrace. Scutcheons, and coats of armor hereditary, where they have any eminent privileges, are honorable, otherwise not, for their power consisteth either in such privileges, or in riches, or some such thing as is equally honored in other men. This kind of honor, commonly called gentry, has been derived from the antient Germans. For there never was any such thing known, where the German customs were unknown. Nor is it now anywhere in use, where the Germans have not inhabited. The antient Greek commanders, when they went to war, had their shields painted with such devices as they pleased, insomuch as an unpainted buckler was a signa of poverty, and of a common soldier, but they transmitted not the inheritance of them. The Romans transmitted the marks of their families, but they were the images, not the devices of their ancestors. Amongst the people of Asia, Afrique, and America, there is not, nor was ever, any such thing. The Germans only had that custom, from whom it has been derived into England, France, Spain, and Italy, when in great numbers they either aided the Romans, or made their own conquests in these western parts of the world. For Germany, being antiently, as all other countries, in their beginnings, divided amongst an infinite number of little lords, or masters of families, that continually had wars one with another, those masters, or lords, principally to the end they might, when they were covered with arms, be known by their followers, and partly for ornament, both painted their armor, or their scutcheon, or coat, with the picture of some beast, or other thing, and also put some eminent and visible mark upon the crest of their helmets. And his ornament both of the arma, and crest, descended by inheritance to their children, to the eldest pure, and to the rest with some note of diversity, such as the old master, that is to say in Dutch, the Herald thought fit. But when many such families, joined together, made a greater monarchy, this duty of the Herald, to distinguish scutcheons, was made a private office apart. And the issue of these lords, is the great and antient gentry, which for the most part bear living creatures, noted for courage, and rapine, or castles, battlements, belts, weapons, bars, palisadoes, and other notes of war, nothing being then in honor, but virtu military. Afterwards, not only kings, but popular commonwealths, gave divers manners of scutcheons, to such as went forth to the war or returned from it, for encouragement, or recompense to their service. All which, by an observing reader, may be found in such ancient histories, Greek, and Latine, as make mention of the German nation, and manners, and their times. Titles of honor. Titles of honor, such as are Duke, Count, Marquis, and Baron, are honorable, as signifying the value set upon them by the sovereign power of the Commonwealth, which titles, were in old time titles of office, and command, derived some from the Romans, some from the Germans, and French. Dukes, in Latine duces, being generals in war, counts, comites, such as bear the general company out of friendship, and were left to govern and defend places conquered, and pacified, marquises, martians, were counts that governed the marches, or bounds of the empire. Which titles of duke, count, and marquis came into the empire, about the time of Constantine the Great, from the customs of the German militia. But baron seems to have been a title of the Gaul, and signifies a great man, such as were the kings, or princes' men, whom they employed in war about their persons, and seems to be derived from vir, to bur, and bar, that signified the same in the language of the Gaul, that vir in Latine, and thence to baro, and baro, so that such men were called barones, and after barones, and, in Spanish, barones. But he that would know more particularly the original of titles of honor, may find it, as I have done this, in Mr. Selden's most excellent treatise of that subject. In process of time these offices of honor, by occasion of trouble, and for reasons of good and peaceable government, were turned into mere titles, serving for the most part, to distinguish the precedence, place, and order of subjects in the Commonwealth, and men were made dukes, counts, marquises, and barons of places, wherein they had neither possession, nor command, and other titles also, were devised to the same end. Worthiness. Fitness. Worthiness is a thing different from the worth, or value of a man, and also from his merit, or desert, and consisteth in a particular power, or ability for that, whereof he is said to be worthy, which particular ability is usually named fitness, or aptitude. For he is worthiest to be a commander, to be a judge, or to have any other charge, that is best fitted, with the qualities required to the well discharging of it, and worthiest of riches, that has the qualities most requisite for the well using of them, any of which qualities being absent, one may nevertheless be a worthy man, and valuable for something else. Again, a man may be worthy of riches, office, and employment, that nevertheless can plead no right to have it before another, and therefore cannot be said to merit or deserve it. For merit presupposeth a right, and that the thing deserved is due by promise, of which I shall say more hereafter, when I shall speak of contracts. Chapter 11. Of the difference of manners. What is here meant by manners? By manners, I mean not here decency of behavior, as how one man should salute another, or how a man should wash his mouth, or pick his teeth before company, and such other points of the small morals, but those qualities of mankind, that concern their living together in peace, and unity. To which end we are to consider, that the felicity of this life, consisteth not in the repose of a mind satisfied. For there is no such finis ultimus, utmostum, nor summum bonum, greatest good, as is spoken of in the books of the old moral philosophers. Nor can a man any more live, whose desires are at an end, than he whose senses and imaginations are at a stand. Felicity is a continual progress of the desire, from one object to another, the attaining of the former, being still but the way to the later. The cause whereof is, that the object of man's desire, is not to enjoy once only and for one instant of time, but to assure forever, the way of his future desire. And therefore the voluntary actions, and inclinations of all men, tend, not only to the procuring, but also to the assuring of a contented life, and differ only in the way which ariseth partly from the diversity of passions, in divers men, and partly from the difference of the knowledge, or opinion each one has of the causes, which produce the effect desired. A restless desire of power, in all men. So that in the first place, I put for a general inclination of all mankind, a perpetual and restless desire of power after power, that ceaseth only in death. And the cause of this, is not always that a man hopes for a more intensive delight, than he has already attained to, or that he cannot be content with a moderate power, but because he cannot assure the power and means to live well, which he hath present, without the acquisition of more. And from hence it is, that kings, whose power is greatest, turn their endeavors to the assuring it a home by laws, or abroad by wars, and when that is done, there succeedeth a new desire, in some, of fame from new conquest, in others, of ease and sensual pleasure, in others, of admiration, or being flattered for excellence in some art, or other ability of the mind. Love of contention from competition. Competition of riches, honor, command, or other power, inclineth to contention, enmity, and war, because the way of one competitor, to the attaining of his desire, is to kill, subdue, supplant, or repel the other. Particularly, competition of praise, inclineth to a reverence of antiquity. For men contend with the living, not with the dead, to these ascribing more than due, that they may obscure the glory of the other. Civil obedience from love of ease. Desire of ease, and sensual delight, disposeth men to obey a common power, because by such desires, a man doth abandon the protection might be hoped for from his own industry, and labor. From fear of death or wounds. Fear of death, and wounds, disposeth to the same, and for the same reason. On the contrary, needy men, and hardy, not contented with their present condition, as also all men that are ambitious of military command, are inclined to continue the causes of war, and to stir up trouble and sedition, for there is no honor military but by war, nor any such hope to mend an ill game, as by causing a new shuffle. And from love of arts, desire of knowledge, and arts of peace, inclineth men to obey a common power, for such desire containeth a desire of leisure, and consequently protection from some other power than their own. Love of virtue, from love of praise. Desire of praise, disposeth to laudable actions, such as please them whose judgment they value, for of these men whom we contemn also the praises. Desire of fame after death does the same. And though after death, there be no sense of the praise given us on earth, as being joys, that are either swallowed up in the unspeakable joys of heaven, or extinguished in the extreme torments of hell, yet is not such fame vain, because men have a present delight therein, from the foresight of it, and of the benefit that may rebound thereby to their posterity, which though they now see not, yet they imagine, and anything that is pleasure in the sense, the same also is pleasure in the imagination. Hate, from difficulty of requiting great benefits. To have received from one, to whom we think ourselves equal, greater benefits than there is hope to requite, disposeth to counterfeit love, but really secret hatred, and puts a man into the estate of a desperate debtor, that in declining the sight of his creditor, tacitly wishes him there, where he might never see him more. For benefits oblige, and obligation is thraldom, which is to one's equal, hateful. But to have received benefits from one, whom we acknowledge our superior, inclines to love, because the obligation is no new depression, and cheerful acceptation, which men call gratitude, is such an honor done to the obliger, as is taken generally for retribution. Also to receive benefits, though from an equal, or inferior, as long as there is hope of requital, disposeth to love, for in the intention of the receiver, the obligation is of aid, and service mutual, from whence proceedeth an emulation of who shall exceed in benefiting, the most noble and profitable contention possible, wherein the victor is pleased with his victory, and the other revenged by confessing it. And from conscience of deserving to be hated. To have done more hurt to a man, than he can, or is willing to expiate, inclineth the doer to hate the sufferer. For he must expect revenge, or forgiveness, both which are hateful. Promptness to hurt, from fear. Fear of oppression, disposeth a man to anticipate, or to seek aid by society, for there is no other way by which a man can secure his life and liberty. And from distrust of their own wit. Men that distrust their own subtlety, are in tumult, and sedition, better disposed for victory, than they that suppose themselves wise, or crafty. For these love to consult, the other, fearing to be circumvented, to strike first. And in sedition, men being always in the precincts of battle, to hold together, and use all advantages of force, is a better stratagem, than any that can proceed from subtlety of wit. Vain undertaking from vainglory. Vainglorious men, such as without being conscious to themselves of great sufficiency, delight in supposing themselves gallant men, are inclined only to ostentation, but not to attempt, because when danger or difficulty appears, they look for nothing but to have their insufficiency discovered. Vainglorious men, such as estimate their sufficiency by the flattery of other men, or the fortune of some precedent action, without assured ground of hope from the true knowledge of themselves, are inclined to rash engaging, and in the approach of danger, or difficulty, to retire if they can, because not seeing the way of safety, they will rather hazard their honor, which may be salved with an excuse, than their lives, for which no salve is sufficient. Ambition, from opinion of sufficiency. Men that have a strong opinion of their own wisdom in matter of government, are disposed to ambition. Because without public employment in council or magistracy, the honor of their wisdom is lost. And therefore eloquent speakers are inclined to ambition, for eloquence seemeth wisdom, both to themselves and others. Irresolution, from too great valuing of small matters. Pusillanimity disposeth men to irresolution, and consequently to lose the occasions, and fittest opportunities of action. For after men have been in deliberation till the time of action approach, if it be not then manifest what is best to be done, 'tis a signa, the difference of motives, the one way and the other, are not great, therefore not to resolve then, is to lose the occasion by weighing of trifles, which is pusillanimity. Frugality, though in poor men a virtue, maketh a man unapt to achieve such actions, as require the strength of many men at once, for it weakeneth their endeavor, which is to be nourished and kept in vigor by reward. Confidence in others from ignorance of the marks of wisdom and kindness a eloquence, with flattery, disposeth men to confide in them that have it, because the former is seeming wisdom, the later seeming kindness a. Added to them military reputation, and it disposeth men to adhere, and subject themselves to those men that have them. The two former, having given them caution against danger from him, the later gives them caution against danger from others. And from the ignorance of natural causes. One of science, that is, ignorance of causes, disposeth, or rather constraineth a man to rely on the advice and authority of others. For all men whom the truth concerns, if they rely not on their own, must rely on the opinion of some other, whom they think wiser than themselves, and see not why he should deceive them. And from one of understanding. Ignorance of the signification of words, which is, one of understanding, disposeth men to take on trust, not only the truth they know not, but also the errors, and which is more, the nonsense of them they trust, for neither error, nor nonsense, can without a perfect understanding of words, be detected. From the same it proceedeth, that men give different names, to one and the same thing, from the difference of their own passions, as they that approve a private opinion, call it opinion, but they that mislike it, heresy, and yet heresy signifies no more than private opinion, but has only a greater tincture of choler. From the same also it proceedeth, that men cannot distinguish, without study and great understanding, between one action of many men, and many actions of one multitude, as for example, between the one action of all the senators of Rome in killing Catiline, and the many actions of a number of senators in killing Caesar, and therefore are disposed to take for the action of the people, that which is a multitude of actions done by a multitude of men, led perhaps by the persuasion of one. Adherence to custom, from ignorance of the nature of right and wrong, ignorance of the causes, and original constitution of right, equity, law, and justice, disposeth the man to make custom and example the rule of his actions, in such manner, as to think that unjust which it hath been the custom to punish, and that just, of the impunity and approbation whereof they can produce an example, or, as the lawyers which only use the false measure of justice barbarously call it, a precedent, like little children, that have no other rule of good and of ill manners, but the correction they receive from their parents and masters, save that children are constant to their rule, whereas men are not so, because grown strong and stubborn, they appeal from custom to reason, and from reason to custom, as it serves their turn, receding from custom when their interest requires it, and setting themselves against reason, as oft as reason is against them, which is the cause, that the doctrine of right and wrong is perpetually disputed, both by the pen and the sword, whereas the doctrine of lines and figures is not so, because men care not, in that subject what be truth, as a thing that crosses no man's ambition, profit, or lust. For I doubt not, but if it had been a thing contrary to any man's right of dominion, or to the interest of men that have dominion, that the 3 angles of a triangle should be equal to 2 angles of a square, that doctrine should have been, if not disputed, yet by the burning of all books of geometry, suppressed, as far as he whom it concerned was able. Adherence to private men, from ignorance of the causes of peace, ignorance of remote causes, disposeth men to attribute all events, to the causes immediate, and instrumental, for these are all the causes they perceive. And hence it comes to pass, that in all places, men that are grieved with payments to the public, discharge their anger upon the publicans, that is to say, farmers, collectors, and other officers of the public revenue, and adhere to such as find fault with the public government, and thereby, when they have engaged themselves beyond hope of justification, fall also upon the supreme authority, for fear of punishment, or shame of receiving pardon. Credulity from ignorance of nature. Ignorance of natural causes disposeth the man to credulity, so as to believe many times impossibilities, for such know nothing to the contrary, but that they may be true, being unable to detect the impossibility. And credulity, because men love to be hearkened unto in company, disposeth them to lying, so that ignorance itself without malice, is able to make a man both to believe lies, and tell them, and sometimes also to invent them. Curiosity to know, from care of future time. Anxiety for the future time, disposeth men to inquire into the causes of things, because the knowledge of them, maketh men the better able to order the present to their best advantage. Natural religion, from the same. Curiosity, or love of the knowledge of causes, draws a man from consideration of the effect, to seek the cause, and again, the cause of that cause, till of necessity he must come to this thought at last, that there is some cause, whereof there is no former cause, but it is eternal, which is it men call God. So that it is impossible to make any profound inquiry into natural causes, without being inclined thereby to believe there is one God eternal, though they cannot have any idea of him in their mind, answerable to his nature. For as a man that is born blind, hearing men talk of warming themselves by the fire, and being brought to warm himself by the same, may easily conceive, and assure himself, there is somewhat there, which men call fire, and is the cause of the heat he feels, but cannot imagine what it is like, nor have an idea of it in his mind, such as they have that see it, so also, By the visible things of this world, and their admirable order, a man may conceive there is a cause of them, which men call God, and yet not have an idea or image of him in his mind. And they that make little or no inquiry into the natural causes of things, yet from the fear that proceeds from the ignorance itself, of what it is that hath the power to do them much good or harm, are inclined to suppose, and feign unto themselves, several kinds of powers invisible, and to stand in awe of their own imaginations, and in time of distress to invoke them, as also in the time of an expected good success, to give them thanks, making the creatures of their own fancy, their gods. By which means it hath come to pass, that from the innumerable variety of fancy, men have created in the world innumerable sorts of gods. And this fear of things invisible, is the natural seed of that, which every one in himself calleth religion, and in them that worship, or fear that power otherwise than they do, superstition. And this seed of religion, having been observed by many, some of those that have observed it, have been inclined thereby to nourish, dress, and form it into laws, and to add to it of their own invention, any opinion of the causes of future events, by which they thought they should best be able to govern others, and make unto themselves the greatest use of their powers. Chapter 12. Of Religion. Religion, in man onely. Seeing there are no signa, nor fruit of religion, but in man only, there is no cause to doubt, but that the seed of religion, is also only in man, and consisteth in some peculiar quality, or at least in some eminent degree thereof, not to be found in other living creatures. First, from his desire of knowing causes. And first, it is peculiar to the nature of man, to be inquisitive into the causes of the events they see, some more, some less, but all men so much, as to be curious in the search of the causes of their own good and of ill fortune. From the consideration of the beginning of things. Secondly, upon the sight of anything that hath a beginning, to think also it had a cause, which determined the same to begin, than when it did, rather than sooner or later. From his observation of the sequel of things. Thirdly, whereas there is no other felicity of beasts, but the enjoying of their quotidian food, ease, and lusts, as having little or no foresight of the time to come, for want of observation, and memory of the order, consequence, and dependence of the things they see, man observeth how one event hath been produced by another, and remembereth in them antecedents and consequence, and when he cannot assure himself of the true causes of things, for the causes of good and of ill fortune for the most part are invisible, he supposes causes of them, either such as his own fancy suggesteth, or trusteth to the authority of other men, such as he thinks to be his friends and wiser than himself. The natural cause of religion, the anxiety of the time to come, the two first, make anxiety. For being assured that there be causes of all things that have arrived hitherto, or shall arrive hereafter, it is impossible for a man, who continually endeavoureth to secure himself against the evil he fears, and procure the good he desireth, not to be in a perpetual solicitude of the time to come, so that every man, especially those that are over-provident, are in an estate like to that of Prometheus. For as Prometheus, which interpreted, is, the prudent man, was bound to the hill Caucasus, a place of large prospect, where, an eagle feeding on his liver, devoured in the day, as much as was repaired in the night, so that man, which looks too far before him, in the care of future time, hath his heart all the day long, not on by fear of death, poverty, or other calamity, and has no repose, nor pause of his anxiety, but in sleep. Which makes them fear the power of invisible things. This perpetual fear, always accompanying mankind in the ignorance of causes, as it were in the dark, must needs have for object something. And therefore when there is nothing to be seen, there is nothing to accuse, either of their good or of ill fortune, but some power or agent invisible, in which sense perhaps it was, that some of the old poets said, that the gods were at first created by humane fear, which spoken of the gods, that is to say, of the many gods of the Gentiles, is very true. But the acknowledging of one God eternal, infinite, and omnipotent, may more easily be derived, from the desire men have to know the causes of natural bodies, and their several virtues, and operations, than from the fear of what was to befall them in time to come. For he that from any effect he seeth come to pass, should reason to the next and immediate cause thereof, and from thence to the cause of that cause, and plunge himself profoundly in the pursuit of causes, shall at last come to this, that there must be, as even the heathen philosophers confessed, one first mover, that is, a first, and an eternal cause of all things, which is that which men mean by the name of God, and all this without thought of their fortune, the solicitude whereof, both inclines to fear, and hinders them from the search of the causes of other things, and thereby gives occasion of feigning of as many gods, as there be men that feign them, and suppose them incorporeal. And for the matter, or substance of the invisible agents, so fancied, they could not by natural cogitation, fall upon any other conceit, but that it was the same with that of the soul of man, and that the soul of man was of the same substance with that which appeareth in a dream, to one that sleepeth, or in a looking glass, to one that is awake, which, men not knowing that such apparitions are nothing else but creatures of the fancy, think to be real and external substances, and therefore call them ghosts, as the Latines called them imagines and umbri, and thought them spirits, that is, thin aerial bodies, and those invisible agents, which they feared, to be like them, save that they appear, and vanish when they please. But the opinion that such spirits were incorporeal, or immaterial, could never enter into the mind of any man by nature, because, though men may put together words of contradictory signification as spirit and incorporeal, yet they can never have the imagination of anything answering to them, and therefore, men that by their own meditation, arrive to the acknowledgement of one infinite, omnipotent, and eternal God, choose rather to confess he is incomprehensible, and above their understanding, than to define his nature by spirit incorporeal, and then confess their definition to be unintelligible, or if they give him such a title, it is not dogmatically, with intention to make the divine nature understood, but piously, to honor him with attributes, of significations, as remote as they can from the grossness of bodies visible. But know not the way how they affect anything. Then, for the way by which they think these invisible agents wrought their effects, that is to say, what immediate causes they used, in bringing things to pass, men that know not what it is that we call causing, that is, almost all men, have no other rule to guess by, but by observing, and remembering what they have seen to precede the like effect at some other time, or times before, without seeing between the antecedent and subsequent event, any dependence or connection at all, and therefore from the like things past, they expect the like things to come, and hope for good or evil luck, superstitiously, from things that have no part at all in the causing of it, as the Athenians did for their war at Lepanto, demand another Formio, the Pompeian faction for their war in Afrique, another Scipio, and others have done in divers other occasions since. In like manner they attribute their fortune to a stander-by, to a lucky or unlucky place, to words spoken, especially if the name of God be amongst them, as charming and conjuring, the liturgy of witches, insomuch as to believe, they have power to turn a stone into bread, bread into a man, or anything, into anything. But honor them as they honor men. Thirdly, for the worship which naturally men exhibit to powers invisible, it can be no other, but such expressions of their reverence, as they would use towards men, gifts, petitions, thanks, submission of body, considerate addresses, sober behavior, premeditated words, swearing, that is, assuring one another of their promises, by invoking them. Beyond that reason suggesteth nothing, but leaves them either to rest there, or for further ceremonies, to rely on those they believe to be wiser than themselves, and attribute to them all extraordinary events. Lastly, concerning how these invisible powers declare to men the things which shall hereafter come to pass, especially concerning their good or evil fortune in general, or good or ill success in any particular undertaking, men are naturally at a stand, save that using to conjecture of the time to come, by the time past, they are very apt, not only to take casual things, after one or two encounters, for prognostiques of the like encounter ever after, but also to believe the like prognostiques from other men, of whom they have once conceived a good opinion. 4 things, natural seeds of religion. And in these 4 things, opinion of ghosts, ignorance of second causes, devotion towards what men fear, and taking of things casual for prognostiques, consisteth the natural seed of religion, which by reason of the different fancies, judgments, and passions of several men, hath grown up into ceremonies so different, that those which are used by one man, are for the most part ridiculous to another. Made different by culture. For these seeds have received culture from 2 sorts of men. One sort have been they, that have nourished, and ordered them, according to their own invention. The other, have done it, by God's commandment, and direction, but both sorts have done it, with a purpose to make those men that relied on them, the more apt to obedience, laws, peace, charity, and civil society. So that the religion of the former sort, is a part of humane politique, and teacheth part of the duty which earthly kings require of their subjects. And the religion of the later sort is divine politique, and containeth precepts to those that have yielded themselves subjects in the kingdom of God. Of the former sort, were all the founders of commonwealths, and the lawgivers of the Gentiles. Of the later sort, were Abraham, Moses, and our blessed Saviour, by whom have been derived unto us the laws of the kingdom of God. The absurd opinion of gentilism. And for that part of religion, which consisteth in opinions concerning the nature of powers invisible, there is almost nothing that has a name, that has not been esteemed amongst the Gentiles, in one place or another, a god, or divel, or by their poets feigned to be inanimated, inhabited, or possessed by some spirit or other. The unformed matter of the world was a god, by the name of chaos. The heaven, the ocean, the planets, the fire, the earth, the winds, were so many gods. Men, women, a bird, a crocodile, a calf, a dogga, a snake, an onion, a leek, deified. Besides, that they filled almost all places, with spirits called demons, the plains, with Pan, and Panises, or satyrs, the woods, with fauns, and nymphs, the sea, with tritons, and other nymphs, every river, and fountain, with a ghost of his name, and with nymphs, every house, with it lares, or familiars, every man, with his genius, hell, with ghosts, and spiritual officers, as Charon, Cerberus, and the Furies, and in the night time, all places with larvae, lemurs, ghosts of men deceased, and a whole kingdom of fairies, and bugbears. They have also ascribed divinity, and built temples to mere accidents, and qualities, such as are time, night, day, peace, concord, love, contention, virtue, honor, health, rust, fever, and the like, which when they prayed for, or against, they prayed to, as if there were ghosts of those names hanging over their heads, and letting fall, or withholding that good, or of ill, for, or against which they prayed. They invoked also their own wit, by the name of muses, their own ignorance, by the name of fortune, their own lust, by the name of Cupid, their own rage, by the name Furies, their own privy members by the name of Priapus, and attributed their pollutions, to incubi, and succubi, insomuch as there was nothing, which a poet could introduce as a person in his poem, which they did not make either a god, or a divil. The same authors of the religion of the Gentiles, observing the second ground for religion, which is men's ignorance of causes, and thereby their aptness to attribute their fortune to causes, on which there was no dependence at all apparent, took occasion to obtrude on their ignorance, instead of second causes, a kind of second and ministerial gods, ascribing the cause of fecundity, to Venus, the cause of arts, to Apollo, of subtlety and craft, to Mercury, of tempests and storms, to Aeolus, and of other effects, to other gods, insomuch as there was amongst the heathen almost as great variety of gods, as of business. And to the worship, which naturally men conceived fit to be used towards their gods, namely oblations, prayers, thanks, and the rest formerly named, the same legislators of the Gentiles have added their images, both in picture and sculpture, that the more ignorant sort, that is to say, the most part, or generality of the people, thinking the gods for whose representation they were made, were really included, and as it were housed within them, might so much the more stand in fear of them, and endow them with lands, and houses, and officers, and revenues, set apart from all other humane uses, that is, consecrated, and made holy to those their idols, as caverns, groves, woods, mountains, and whole islands, and have attributed to them, not only the shapes, some of men, some of beasts, some of monsters, but also the faculties, and passions of men and beasts, as sense, speech, sex, lust, generation, and this not only by mixing one with another, to propagate the kind of gods, but also by mixing with men and women, to beget mongrel gods, and but inmates of heaven, as Bacchus, Hercules, and others, besides, anger, revenge, and other passions of living creatures, and the actions proceeding from them, as fraud, theft, adultery, sodomy, and any vice that may be taken for an effective power, or a cause of pleasure, and all such vices, as amongst men are taken to be against law, rather than against honor. Lastly, to the prognostics of time to come, which are naturally but conjectures upon the experience of time past, and supernatural, divine revelation, the same authors of the religion of the Gentiles, partly upon pretended experience, partly upon pretended revelation, have added innumerable other superstitious ways of divination, and made men believe they should find their fortunes, sometimes in the ambiguous or senseless answers of the priests at Delphi, Delos, Ammon, and other famous oracles, which answers were made ambiguous by design, to own the event both ways, or absurd by the intoxicating vapor of the place, which is very frequent in sulphurous cavern, sometimes in the leaves of the Sibylls, of whose prophecies, like those perhaps of Nostradamus, for the fragments now extant seem to be the invention of later times, there were some books in reputation in the time of the Roman Republic, sometimes in the insignificant speeches of madmen, supposed to be possessed with a divine spirit, which possession they called enthusiasm, and these kinds of foretelling events, were accounted theomancy, or prophecy, sometimes in the aspect of the stars at their nativity, which was called horoscopy, and esteemed a part of judiciary astrology, sometimes in their own hopes and fears, called thaumomancy, or presage, sometimes in the prediction of witches, that pretended conference with the dead, which is called necromancy, conjuring, and witchcraft, and is but juggling and confederate knavery, sometimes in the casual flight, or feeding of birds, called augury, sometimes in the entrails of a sacrificed beast, which was erispicina, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in croaking of ravens, or chattering of birds, sometimes in the lineaments of the face, which was called metoposcopy, or by palmistry in the lines of the hand, in casual words, called omena, sometimes in monsters, or unusual accidents, as eclipses, comets, rare meteors, earthquakes, inundations, uncouth births, and the like, which they called portenta and ostenta, because they thought them to portend, or foreshow some great calamity to come, sometimes, in mere lottery, as cross and pile, counting holes in a sieve, dipping of verses in Homer and Virgil, and innumerable other such vain conceits. So easy are men to be drawn to believe anything, from such men as have gotten credit with them, and can with gentleness and dexterity, take hold of their fear and ignorance. The designs of the authors of the religion of the heathen, and therefore the first founders, and legislators of commonwealths amongst the Gentiles, whose ends were only to keep the people in obedience, and peace, have in all places taken care, first, to imprint in their minds a belief, that those precepts which they gave concerning religion, might not be thought to proceed from their own device, but from the dictates of some god, or other spirit, or else that they themselves were of a higher nature than mere mortals, that their laws might the more easily be received. So Numa Pompilius pretended to receive the ceremonies he instituted amongst the Romans, from the Nymphageria, and the first king and founder of the kingdom of Peru, pretended himself and his wife to be the children of the Sunnah, and Mahomet, to set up his new religion, pretended to have conferences with the Holy Ghost, in form of a dove. Secondly, they have had a care, to make it believed, that the same things were displeasing to the gods, which were forbidden by the laws. Thirdly, to prescribe ceremonies, supplications, sacrifices, and festivals, by which they were to believe, the anger of the gods might be appeased, and that ill success in war, great contagions of sickness, earthquakes, and each man's private misery, came from the anger of the gods, and their anger from the neglect of their worship, or the forgetting, or mistaking some point of the ceremonies required. And though amongst the antient Romans, men were not forbidden to deny, that which in the poets is written of the pains, and pleasures after this life, which divers of great authority, and gravity in that state have in their harangues openly derided, yet that belief was alwise more cherished, than the contrary. And by these, and such other institutions, they obtained in order to their end, which was the peace of the commonwealth, that the common people in their misfortunes, laying the fault on neglect, or error in their ceremonies, or on their own disobedience to the laws, were the less apt to mutiny against their governors. And being entertained with the pomp, and pastime of festivals, and public gomes, made in honor of the gods, needed nothing else but bread, to keep them from discontent, murmuring, and commotion against the state. And therefore the Romans, that had conquered the greatest part of the then known world, made no scruple of tolerating any religion whatsoever in the city of Rome itself, unless it had something in it, that could not consist with their civil government. Nor do we read, that any religion was there forbidden, but that of the Jews, who, being the peculiar kingdom of God, thought it unlawful to acknowledge subjection to any mortal king or state whatsoever. And thus you see how the religion of the Gentiles was a part of their policy. The true religion, and the laws of God's kingdom the same, but where God himself, by supernatural revelation, planted religion, there he also made to himself a peculiar kingdom, and gave laws, not only of behavior towards himself, but also towards one another, and thereby in the kingdom of God, the policy and law civil are a part of religion, and therefore the distinction of temporal and spiritual domination hath there no place. It is true, that God is king of all the earth, yet may he be king of a peculiar and chosen nation. For there is no more incongruity therein, than that he that hath the general command of the whole army, should have withal a peculiar regiment, or company of his own. God is king of all the earth by his power, but of his chosen people, he is king by covenant. But to speak more largely of the kingdom of God, both by nature and covenant, I have in the following discourse assigned another place. The causes of change in religion. From the propagation of religion, it is not hard to understand the causes of the resolution of the same into its first seeds, or principles, which are only an opinion of a deity, and powers invisible and supernatural, that can never be so abolished out of humane nature, but that new religions may again be made to spring out of them, by the culture of such men, as for such purpose are in reputation. For seeing all formed religion, is founded at first, upon the faith which a multitude hath in some one person, whom they believe not only to be a wise man, and to labor to procure their happiness, but also to be a holy man, to whom God himself vouchsafeth to declare his will supernaturally. It followeth necessarily, when they that have the government of religion shall come to have either the wisdom of those men, their sincerity, or their love suspected, or that they shall be unable to show any probable token of divine revelation, that the religion which they desire to uphold, must be suspected likewise, and, without the fear of the civil sword, contradicted and rejected. Enjoining belief of impossibilities. That which taketh away the reputation of wisdom, in him that formeth a religion, or addeth to it when it is already formed, is the enjoining of a belief of contradictories, for both parts of a contradiction cannot possibly be true, and therefore to enjoin the belief of them, is an argument of ignorance, which detects the author in that, and discredits him in all things else he shall propound as from revelation supernatural, which revelation a man may indeed have of many things above, but of nothing against natural reason. Doing contrary to the religion they establish. That which taketh away the reputation of sincerity, is the doing, or saying of such things, as appear to be seen, that what they require other men to believe, is not believed by themselves, all which doings, or sayings are therefore called scandalous, because they be stumbling blocks, that make men to fall in the way of religion, as injustice, cruelty, profaneness, avarice and luxury. For who can believe, that he that doth ordinarily such actions, as proceed from any of these roots, believeth there is any such invisible power to be feared, as he affrighteth other men withal, for lesser faults? That which taketh away the reputation of love, is the being detected of private ends, as when the belief they require of others, conduceth or seemeth to conduce to the acquiring of dominion, riches, dignity, or secure pleasure, to themselves only, or specially. For that which men reap benefit by to themselves, they are thought to do for their own sakes, and not for love of others. One of the testimony of miracles. Lastly, the testimony that men can render of divine calling, can be no other, than the operation of miracles, or true prophecy, which also is a miracle, or extraordinary felicity. And therefore, to those points of religion, which have been received from them that did such miracles, those that are added by such, as approve not their calling by some miracle, obtain no greater belief, than what the custom, and laws of the places, in which they be educated, have wrought into them. For as in natural things, men of judgment require natural signa, and arguments, so in supernatural things, they require signa supernatural, which are miracles, before they consent inwardly, and from their hearts. All which causes of the weakening of men's faith, do manifestly appear in the examples following. First, we have the example of the children of Israel, who when Moses, that had approved his calling to them by miracles, and by the happy conduct of them out of Egypt, was absent but 40 days, revolted from the worship of the true God, recommended to them by him, and setting up, Exod 32:1-2, a golden calf for their God, relapsed into the idolatry of the Egyptians, from whom they had been so lately delivered. And again, after Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and that generation which had seen the great works of God in Israel, Judges 2:11, were dead, another generation arose, and served Baal. So that miracles failing, faith also failed. Again, when the sons of Samuel, 1 Sam 8:3, being constituted by their father judges in Bersabee, received bribes, and judged unjustly, the people of Israel refused any more to have God to be their king, in other manner than he was king of other people, and therefore cried out to Samuel, to choose them a king after the manner of the nations. So that justice failing, faith also failed, insomuch as they deposed their God, from reigning over them. And whereas in the planting of Christian religion, the oracle ceased in all parts of the Roman Empire, and the number of Christians increased wonderfully every day, and in every place, by the preaching of the apostles and evangelists, a great part of that success may reasonably be attributed to the contempt into which the priests of the Gentiles of that time had brought themselves, by their uncleanness, avarice, and juggling between princes. Also the religion of the Church of Rome was partly for the same cause abolished in England, and many other parts of Christendom, insomuch as the failing of virtue in the pastors maketh faith fail in the people, and partly from bringing of the philosophy and doctrine of Aristotle into religion, by the schoolmen, from whence there arose so many contradictions, and absurdities, as brought the clergy into a reputation both of ignorance, and of fraudulent intention, and inclined people to revolt from them, either against the will of their own princes, as in France and Holland, or with their will, as in England. Lastly, amongst the points by the Church of Rome declared necessary for salvation, there be so many, manifestly to the advantage of the Pope, and of his spiritual subjects, residing in the territories of other Christian princes, that were it not for the mutual emulation of those princes, they might without war, or trouble, exclude all foreign authority, as easily as it has been excluded in England. For who is there that does not see, to whose benefit it conduceth, to have it believed, that a king hath not his authority from Christ, unless a bishop crown him? That a king, if he be a priest, cannot marry? That whether a prince be born in lawful marriage, or not, must be judged by authority from Rome? That subjects may be freed from their allegiance, if by the court of Rome, the king be judged an heretic? That a king, as Chilperic of France, may be deposed by a pope, as Pope Zachary, for no cause, and his kingdom given to one of his subjects? That the clergy, and regulars, in what country soever, shall be exempt from the jurisdiction of their king, in cases criminal? Or who does not see, to whose profit redound the fees of private masses, and veils of purgatory, with other signia of private interest, enough to mortify the most lively faith, if, as I sighed, the civil magistrate, and custom did not more sustain it, than any opinion they have of the sanctity, wisdom, or probity of their teachers? So that I may attribute all the changes of religion in the world, to one and the same cause, and that is, unpleasing priests, and those not only amongst Catholic, but even in that church that hath presumed most of Reformation. Chapter 13. Of the natural condition of mankind, as concerning their felicity, and misery. Nature hath made men so equal, in the faculties of body, and mind, as that though there be found one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body, or of quicker mind than another, yet when all is reckoned together, the difference between man, and man, is not so considerable, as that one man can thereupon claim to himself any benefit, to which another may not pretend, as well as he. For as to the strength of body, the weakest has strength enough to kill the strongest, either by secret machination, or by confederacy with others, that are in the same danger with himself. And as to the faculties of the mind, setting aside the arts grounded upon words, and especially that skill of proceeding upon general, and infallible rules, called science, which very few have, and but in few things, as being not a native faculty, born with us, nor attained, as prudence, while we look after somewhat else, I find yet a greater equality amongst men, than that of strength. For prudence is but experience, which equal time, equally bestows on all men, in those things they equally apply themselves unto. That which may perhaps make such equality incredible, is but a vain conceit of one's own wisdom, which almost all men think they have in a greater degree, than the vulgar, that is, than all men but themselves, and a few others, whom by fame, or for concurring with themselves, they approve. For such is the nature of men, that howsoever they may acknowledge many others to be more witty, or more eloquent, or more learned, yet they will hardly believe there be many so wise as themselves, for they see their own wit at hand, and other men's at a distance. But this proveth rather that men are in that point equal, than unequal. For there is not ordinarily a greater signa of the equal distribution of anything, than that every man is contented with his share. From equality proceeds diffidence. From this equality of ability, ariseth equality of hope in the attaining of our ends. And therefore if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies, and in the way to their end, which is principally their own conservation, and sometimes their delectation only, endeavor to destroy, or subdue one another. And from hence it comes to pass that where an invader hath no more to fear, than in other man's single power, if one plant, sow, build, or possess a convenient seat, others may probably be expected to come prepared with forces united, to dispossess, and deprive him not only of the fruit of his labor, but also of his life, or liberty. And the invader again is in the like danger of another. From diffidence war. And from this diffidence of one another, there is no way for any man to secure himself, so reasonable, as anticipation, that is, by force, or wiles, to master the persons of all men he can, so long, till he see no other power great enough to endanger him, and this is no more than his own conservation requireth, and is generally allowed. Also because there be some, that taking pleasure in contemplating their own power in the acts of conquest, which they pursue farther than their security requires, if others, that otherwise would be glad to be at ease within modest bounds, should not by invasion increase their power, they would not be able, long time, by standing only on their defense, to subsist. And by consequence, such augmentation of dominion over men, being necessary to a man's conservation, it ought to be allowed him. Again, men have no pleasure, but on the contrary a great deal of grief, in keeping company, where there is no power able to overawe them all. For every man looketh that his companion should value him, at the same rate he sets upon himself, and upon all signia of contempt, or undervaluing, naturally endeavors, as far as he dares, which amongst them that have no common power, to keep them in quiet, is far enough to make them destroy each other, to extort a greater value from his contemners, by damage, and from others, by the example. So that in the nature of man, we find three principal causes of quarrel. First, competition, secondly, diffidence, thirdly, glory. The first, maketh men invade for gain, the second, for safety, and the third, for reputation. The first use violence, to make themselves masters of other men's persons, wives, children, and cattle. The second, to defend them. The third, for trifles, as a word, a smile, a different opinion, and any other signa of undervalue, either direct in their persons, or by reflection in their kindred, their friends, their nation, their profession, or their name. Out of civil states, there is always war of every one against every one. Hereby it is manifest, that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man, against every man. For war consisteth not in battle only, or the act of fighting, but in a tract of time, wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known, and therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war, as it is in the nature of weather. For as the nature of full weather lieth not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereto of many days together, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. During all the time there is no assurance to the contrary. All other time is peace. The incommodities of such a war. Whatsoever therefore is consequent to a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time, wherein men live without other security, than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear, and danger of violent death, and a life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It may seem strange to some man, that has not well weighed these things, that nature should thus dissociate, and render men apt to invade, and destroy one another, and he may therefore, not trusting to this inference, made from the passions, desire perhaps to have the same confirmed by experience. Let him therefore consider with himself, when taking a journey, he arm a himself, and seeks to go well accompanied. When going to sleep, he locks his doors, when even in his house he locks his chests, and this when he knows there be laws, and public officers, armed, to revenge all injuries shall be done him. What opinion he has of his fellow subjects, when he rides armed, of his fellow citizens, when he locks his doors, and of his children and servants, when he locks his chests. Does he not there as much accuse mankind by his actions, as I do by my words? But neither of us accuse man's nature in it. The desires, and other passions of man, are in themselves no sin. No more are the actions, that proceed from those passions, till they know a law that forbids them, which till laws be made they cannot know, nor can any law be made, till they have agreed upon the person that shall make it. It may peradventure be thought, there was never such a time, nor condition of war as this, and I believe it was never generally so, over all the world, but there are many places, where they live so now. For the savage people in many places of America, except the government of small families, the concord whereof dependeth on natural lust, have no government at all, and live at this day in that brutish manner, as I said before. Howsoever, it may be perceived what manner of life there would be, where there were no common power to fear, by the manner of life, which men that have formerly lived under a peaceful government, used to degenerate into, in a civil war. But though there had never been any time, wherein particular men were in a condition of war one against another, yet in all times, kings, and persons of sovereign authority, because of their independency, are in continual jealousies, and in the state and posture of gladiators, having their weapons pointing, and their eyes fixed on one another, that is, their forts, garrisons, and guns upon the frontiers of their kingdoms, and continual spies upon their neighbors, which is a posture of war. But because they uphold thereby the industry of their subjects, there does not follow from it that misery, which accompanies the liberty of particular men. In such a war, nothing is unjust. To this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent, that nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have there no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law, where no law, no injustice. Force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues. Justice and injustice are none of the faculties neither of the body, nor mind. If they were, they might be in a man that were alone in the world, as well as his senses and passions. They are qualities that relate to men in society, not in solitude. It is consequent also to the same condition, that there be no propriety, no dominion, no mine and thine distinct, but only that to be every man's that he can get, and for so long as he can keep it. And thus much for the ill condition, which man by mere nature is actually placed in, though with a possibility to come out of it, consisting partly in the passions, partly in his reason. The passions that incline men to peace. The passions that incline men to peace are fear of death, desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living, and a hope by their industry to obtain them. And reason suggesteth convenient articles of peace, upon which men may be drawn to agreement. These articles are they, which otherwise are called the laws of nature, whereof I shall speak more particularly, in the 2 following chapters. Chapter 14. Of the first and second natural laws, and of contracts. Right of nature what? The right of nature, which writers commonly call jus naturale, is the liberty each man hath, to use his own power, as he will himself, for the preservation of his own nature, that is to say, of his own life, and consequently, of doing anything, which in his own judgment, and reason, he shall conceive to be the aptest means thereunto. Liberty what? By liberty, is understood, according to the proper signification of the word, the absence of external impediments, which impediments may oft take away part of a man's power to do what he would, but cannot hinder him from using the power left him, according as his judgment and reason shall dictate to him. A law of nature what? A law of nature, lex naturalis, is a precept, or general rule, found out by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life, or taketh away the means of preserving the same, and to omit that by which he thinketh it may be best preserved. For though they that speak of this subject used to confound jus and lex, right and law, yet they ought to be distinguished, because right consisteth in liberty to do or to forbear, whereas law determineth and bindeth to one of them, so that law and right differ as much as obligation and liberty, which in one and the same matter are inconsistent. Naturally every man has right to everything. And because the condition of man, as hath been declared in the precedent chapter, is a condition of war of every one against every one, in which case every one is governed by his own reason, and there is nothing he can make use of, that may not be a help unto him, in preserving his life against his enemies, it followeth, that in such a condition, every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body. And therefore, as long as this natural right of every man to everything endureth, there can be no security to any man, how strong or wise soever he be, of living out the time, which nature ordinarily alloweth men to live. The fundamental law of nature. And consequently it is a precept, or general rule of reason, that every man ought to endeavor peace, as far as he has hope of obtaining it, and when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek, and use, all helps, and advantages of war. The first branch, of which rule, containeth the first and fundamental law of nature, which is, to seek peace and follow it. The second, the sum of the right of nature, which is, by all means we can, to defend ourselves. The second law of nature. From this fundamental law of nature, by which men are commanded to endeavor peace, is derived this second law, that a man be willing, when others are so too, as far forth, as for peace and defense of himself he shall think it necessary, to lay down this right to all things, and be contented with so much liberty against other men, as he would allow other men against himself. For as long as every man holdeth this right, of doing anything he liketh, so long are all men in the condition of war. But if other men will not lay down their right as well as he, then there is no reason for any one to divest himself of his, for that were to expose himself to prey, which no man is bound to, rather than to dispose himself to peace. This is that law of the gospel, whatsoever you require that others should do to you, that do ye to them. And that law of all men, quod tibi feri non vis, alteri ni feceris. What it is to lay down a right. To lay down a man's right to anything, is to divest himself of the liberty, of hindering another of the benefit of his own right to the same. For he that renounceth, or passeth away his right, giveth not to any other man a right which he had not before, because there is nothing to which every man had not right by nature, but onely standeth out of his way, that he may enjoy his own original right, without hindrance from him, not without hindrance from another. So that the effect which redoundeth to one man, by another man's defect of right, is but so much diminution of impediments to the use of his own right original. Renouncing, or transferring right what? Obligation, duty and justice. Right is laid aside, either by simply renouncing it, or by transferring it to another. By simply renouncing, when he cares not to whom the benefit thereof redoundeth. By transferring, when he intendeth the benefit thereof to some certain person, or persons. And when a man hath in either manner abandoned, or granted away his right, then is he said to be obliged, or bound, not to hinder those, to whom such right is granted, or abandoned, from the benefit of it, and that he ought, and it is duty, not to make void that voluntary act of his own, and that such hindrance as injustice, and injury, as being signed jury, the right being before renounced, or transferred. So that injury, or injustice, in the controversies of the world, is somewhat like to that, which in the disputations of scholars is called absurdity. For as it is there called an absurdity, to contradict what one maintained in the beginning, so in the world, it is called injustice, and injury, voluntarily to undo that, which from the beginning he had voluntarily done. The way by which a man either simply renounceth, or transferreth his right, is a declaration, or signification, by some voluntary and sufficient signa, or signa, that he doth so renounce, or transferre, or hath so renounced, or transferred the same, to him that accepteth it. And these signa are either words only, or actions only, or, as it happeneth most often, both words and actions. And the same are the bonds, by which men are bound, and obliged, bonds, that have their strength, not from their own nature, for nothing is more easily broken than a man's word, but from fear of some evil consequence upon the rupture. Not all rights are alienable. Whensoever a man transferreth his right, or renounceth it, it is either in consideration of some right reciprocally transferred to himself, or for some other good he hopeth for thereby. For it is a voluntary act, and of the voluntary acts of every man, the object is some good to himself. And therefore there be some rights, which no man can be understood by any words, or other signa, to have abandoned, or transferred. As first a man cannot lay down the right of resisting them, that assault him by force, to take away his life, because he cannot be understood to him thereby, at any good to himself. The same may be said of wounds, and chains, and imprisonment, both because there is no benefit consequent to such patience, as there is to the patience of suffering another to be wounded, or imprisoned, as also because a man cannot tell, when he seeth men proceed against him by violence, whether they intend his death or not. And lastly the motive, and end for which this renouncing, and transferring or right is introduced, is nothing else but the security of a man's person, in his life, and in the means of so preserving life, as not to be weary of it. And therefore if a man by words, or other signa, seem to despoil himself of the end, for which those signa were intended, he is not to be understood as if he meant it, or that it was his will, but that he was ignorant of how such words and actions were to be interpreted. Contract what? The mutual transferring of right, is that which men call contract. There is difference, between transferring of right to the thing, and transferring, or tradition, that is, delivery of the thing itself. For the thing may be delivered together with the translation of the right, as in buying and selling with ready money, or exchange of goods, or lands, and it may be delivered some time after. Covenant what? Again, one of the contractors may deliver the thing contracted for on his part, and leave the other to perform his part at some determinate time after, and in the meantime be trusted, and then the contract on his part is called pact, or covenant, or both parts may contract now, to perform hereafter, in which cases, he that is to perform in time to come, being trusted, his performance is called keeping of promise, or faith, and the failing of performance, if it be voluntary, violation of faith. Free gift. When the transferring of right is not mutual, but one of the parties transferreth, in hope to gain thereby friendship, or service from another, or from his friends, or in hope to gain the reputation of charity, or magnanimity, or to deliver his mind from the pain of compassion, or in hope of reward in heaven, this is not contract, but gift, free gift, grace, which words signify one and the same thing. Signa of contract express. Signa of contract are either express, or by inference. Express are words spoken with understanding of what they signify, and such words are either of the time present, or past, as, I give, I grant, I have given, I have granted, I will that this be yours, or of the future, as, I will give, I will grant, which words of the future are called promise. Signa of contract by inference. Signa by inference are sometimes the consequence of words, sometimes the consequence of silence, sometimes the consequence of actions, sometimes the consequence of forbearing an action, and generally a signa by inference, of any contract, is whatsoever sufficiently argues the will of the contractor. Free gift passeth by words of the present or past. Words alone, if they be of the time to come, and contain a bare promise, are an insufficient signa of a free gift and therefore not obligatory. For if they be of the time to come, as, tomorrow I will give, they are a signa I have not given yet, and consequently that my right is not transferred, but remaineth till I transfer it by some other act. But if the words be of the time present, or past, as, I have given, or do give to be delivered tomorrow, then is my tomorrow's right given away today, and that by the virtue of the words, though there were no other argument of my will. And there is a great difference in the signification of these words, volus hoc tuum esse cra, and cras dabo, that is between I will that this be thine tomorrow, and I will give it to thee tomorrow, For the word I will, in the former manner of speech, signifies an act of the will present, but in the later it signifies a promise of an act of the will to come, and therefore the former words, being of the present, transfer a future right, the later, that be of the future, transfer nothing. But if there be other signa of the will to transfer a right, besides words, then, though the gift be free, yet may the right be understood to pass by words of the future, as if a man propound a prize to him that comes first to the end of a race, the gift is free, and though the words be of the future, yet the right passeth, for if he would not have his words so be understood, he should not have let them run. Signa of contract are words both of the past, present, and future in contracts. The right passeth, not only where the words are of the time present, or past, but also where they are of the future, because all contract is mutual translation, or change of right, and therefore he that promiseth onely, because he hath already received the benefit for which he promiseth, is to be understood as if he intended the right should pass for unless he had been content to have his words so understood, the other would not have performed his part first. And for that cause, in buying, and selling, and other acts of contract, a promise is equivalent to a covenant, and therefore obligatory. Merit what? He that performeth first in the case of a contract, is said to merit that which he is to receive by the performance of the other, and he hath it as due. Also when a prize is propounded to many, which is to be given to him only that winneth, or money is thrown amongst many, to be enjoyed by them that catch it, though this be a free gift, yet so to win, or so to catch, is to merit, and to have it as due. For the right is transferred in the propounding of the prize, and in throwing down the money, though it be not determined to whom, but by the event of the contention. But there is between these two sorts of merit, this difference, that in contract, I merit by virtue of my own power, and the contractor's need, but in this case of free gift, I am enabled to merit only by the benignity of the giver. In contract, I merit at the contractor's hand that he should depart with his right. In this case of gift, I merit not that the giver should part with his right, but that when he has parted with it, it should be mine, rather than another's. And this I think to be the meaning of that distinction of the schools, between meritum congrui, and meritum condini. For God Almighty, having promised paradise to those men, hoodwinked with carnal desires, that can walk through this world according to the precepts, and limits prescribed by him, they say, he that shall so walk, shall merit paradise ex congruo. But because no man can demand a right to it, by his own righteousness, or any other power in himself, but by the free grace of God only, they say, no man can merit paradise ex condino. This I say, I think is the meaning of that distinction, but because disputers do not agree upon the signification of their own terms of art, longer than it serves their turn, I will not affirm anything of their meaning, only this I say, when a gift is given indefinitely, as a prize to be contended for, he that winneth meriteth, and may claim the prize as due. Covenants of mutual trust, when invalid. If a covenant be made, wherein neither of the parties perform presently, but trust one another, in the condition of mere nature, which is a condition of war of every man against every man, upon any reasonable suspicion, it is void, but if there be a common power set over them both, with right and force sufficient to compel performance, it is not void. For he that performeth first, has no assurance the other will perform after, because the bonds of words are too weak to bridle men's ambition, avarice, anger, and other passions, without the fear of some coercive power, which in the condition of mere nature, where all men are equal, and judges of the justness of their own fears cannot possibly be supposed. And therefore he which performeth first, does but betray himself to his enemy, contrary to the right, he can never abandon, of defending his life, and means of living. But in a civil estate, where there is a power set up to constrain those that would otherwise violate their faith, that fear is no more reasonable, and for that cause, he which by the covenant is to perform first, is obliged so to do. The cause of fear, which maketh such a covenant invalid, must be always something arising after the covenant made, as some new fact, or other signa of the will not to perform, else it cannot make the covenant void. For that which could not hinder a man from promising, ought not to be admitted as a hindrance of performing. Right to the end, containeth right to the means. He that transferreth any right, transferreth the means of enjoying it, as far as lieth in his power. As he that selleth land, is understood to transfer the herbage, and whatsoever grows upon it, nor can he that sells a mill turn away the stream that drives it. And they that give to a man the right of government in sovereignty, are understood to give him the right of levying money to maintain soldiers, and of appointing magistrates for the administration of justice. No covenant with beasts. To make covenant with brute beasts, is impossible, because not understanding our speech, they understand not, nor accept of any translation of right, nor can translate any right to another, and without mutual acceptation, there is no covenant. Nor with God without special revelation. To make covenant with God, is impossible, but by mediation of such as God speaketh to, either by revelation supernatural, or by his lieutenants that govern under him, and in his name, for otherwise we know not whether our covenants be accepted, or not. And therefore they that vow any thing contrary to any law of nature, vow in vain, as being a thing unjust to pay such vow. And if it be a thing commanded by the law of nature, it is not the vow, but the law that binds them. No covenant, but of possible and future. The matter, or subject of a covenant, is always something that falleth under deliberation. For to covenant, is an act of the will, that is to say an act, and the last act, of deliberation, and is therefore always understood to be something to come, and which is judged possible for him that covenanteth, to perform. And therefore, to promise that which is known to be impossible, is no covenant. But if that prove impossible afterwards, which before was thought possible, the covenant is valid, and bindeth, though not to the thing itself, yet to the value, or, if that also be impossible, to the unfeigned endeavor of performing as much as is possible, for to more no man can be obliged. Covenants how made void. Men are freed of their covenants two ways, by performing, or by being forgiven. For performance, is the natural end of obligation, and forgiveness, the restitution of liberty, as being a retransferring of that right, in which the obligation consisted. Covenants extorted by fear are valid. Covenants entered into by fear, in the condition of mere nature, are obligatory. For example, if I covenant to pay a ransom, or service for my life, to an enemy, I am bound by it. For it is a contract, wherein one receiveth the benefit of life, the other is to receive money, or service for it, and consequently, where no other law, as in the condition, of mere nature, forbiddeth the performance, the covenant is valid. Therefore prisoners of war, if trusted with the payment of their ransom, are obliged to pay it, and if a weaker prince, make a disadvantageous peace with a stronger, for fear, he is bound to keep it, unless, as hath been said before, there ariseth some new, and just cause of fear, to renew the war. And even in commonwealths, if I be forced to redeem myself from a thief by promising him money, I am bound to pay it till the civil law discharge me. For whatsoever I may lawfully do without obligation, the same I may lawfully covenant to do through fear, and what I lawfully covenant, I cannot lawfully break. The former covenant to one, makes void the later to another. A former covenant, makes void a later. For a man that hath passed away is right to one man today, hath it not to pass a tomorrow to another, and therefore the later promise passeth no right, but is null. A man's covenant not to defend himself, is void. A covenant not to defend myself from force, by force, is always void. For, as I have showed before, no man can transfer a, or lay down his right to save himself from death, wounds, and imprisonment, the avoiding whereof is the only end of laying down any right, and therefore the promise of not resisting force, in no covenant transferreth any right, nor is obliging. For though a man may covenant thus, unless I do so, or so, kill me, he cannot covenant thus unless I do so, or so, I will not resist you, when you come to kill me. For man by nature chooseth the lesser of ill, which is danger of death in resisting, rather than the greater, which is certain and present death in not resisting. And this is granted to be true by all men, in that they lead criminals to execution, and prison, with armed men, notwithstanding that such criminals have consented to the law, by which they are condemned. No man obliged to accuse himself. A covenant to accuse oneself, without assurance of pardon, is likewise unbelieved. For in the condition of nature, where every man is judge, there is no place for accusation, and in the civil state, the accusation is followed with punishment, which being force, a man is not obliged not to resist. The same is also true, of the accusation of those, by whose condemnation a man falls into misery, as of a father, wife, or benefactor. For the testimony of such an accuser, if it be not willingly given, is presumed to be corrupted by nature, and therefore not to be received, and where a man's testimony is not to be credited, is not bound to give it. Also accusations upon torture, are not to be reputed as testimonies. For torture is to be used but as means of conjecture, and light, in the further examination and search of truth, and what is in that case confessed, tendeth to the ease of him that is tortured, not to the informing of the torturers, and therefore ought not to have the credit of a sufficient testimony, for whether he deliver himself by true, or false accusation, he does it by the right of preserving his own life. The end of an oath, the form of his oath. The force of words, being, as I have formerly noted, too weak to hold men to the performance of their covenants, there are in man's nature, but two imaginable helps to strengthen it. And those are either a fear of the consequence of breaking their word, or a glory or pride in appearing not to need to break it. This later is a generosity too rarely found to be presumed on, especially in the pursuers of wealth, command, or sensual pleasure, which are the greatest part of mankind. The passion to be reckoned upon, is fear, whereof there be two very general objects, one, the power of spirits invisible, the other, the power of those men they shall therein offend. Of these two, though the former be the greater power, yet the fear of the later is commonly the greater fear. The fear of the former is in every man, his own religion, which hath place in the nature of man before civil society. The later hath not so, at least not place enough, to keep men to their promises, because in the condition of mere nature, the inequality of power is not discerned, but by the event of battle. So that before the time of civil society, or in the interruption thereof by war, there is nothing can strengthen a covenant of peace agreed on, against the temptations of avarice, ambition, lust, or other strong desire, but the fear of that invisible power, which they every one worship as God, and fear as a revenger of their perfidy. All therefore that can be done between two men not subject to civil power, is to put one another to swear by the God he feareth, which swearing or oath, is a form of speech, added to a promise, by which he that promiseth, signifieth, that unless he perform, he renounceth the mercy of his God, or calleth to him for vengeance on himself. Such was the heathen form, let Jupiter kill me else, as I kill this beast. So is our form, I shall do thus and thus, so help me God. And this, with the rites and ceremonies, which every one useth in his own religion, that the fear of breaking faith might be the greater. No oath, but by God. By this it appears, that an oath taken according to any other form, or rite, than his, that sweareth, is in vain, and no oath, and there is no swearing by any thing which the swearer thinks not God. For though men have sometimes used to swear by their kings, for fear or flattery, yet they would have it thereby understood, they attributed to them divine honor. And that swearing unnecessarily by God, is but profaning of his name, and swearing by other things, as men do in common discourse, is not swearing, but an impious custom, gotten by too much vehemence of talking. An oath addeth nothing to the obligation. It appears also that the oath addeth nothing to the obligation. For a covenant, if lawful, binds in the sight of God, without the oath, as much as with it, if unlawful, bindeth not at all, though it be confirmed with an oath. Chapter 15. Of other laws of nature. The third law of nature, justice. From that law of nature, by which we are obliged to transfer to another, such rights, as being retained, hinder the peace of mankind, there followeth a third, which is this, that men perform their covenants made, without which, covenants are in vain, and but empty words, and the right of all men to all things remaining, we are still in the condition of war. Justice and injustice what? And in this law of nature, consisteth the fountain and original of justice. For where no covenant hath proceeded, there hath no right been transferred, and every man has right to everything, and consequently, no action can be unjust. But when a covenant is made, then to break it is unjust, and the definition of injustice, is no other than the not performance of covenant. And whatsoever is not unjust, is just. Justice and propriety begin with the constitution of Commonwealth, but because covenants of mutual trust, where there is a fear of not performance on either part, as hath been said in the former chapter, are invalid, though the original of justice be the making of covenants, yet injustice actually there can be none, till the cause of such fear be taken away, which while men are in the natural condition of war, cannot be done. Therefore before the names of just, and unjust can have place, there must be some coercive power, to compel men equally to the performance of their covenants, by the terror of some punishment, greater than the benefit they expect by the breach of their covenant, and to make good that propriety, which by mutual contract men acquire, in recompense of the universal right they abandon, and such power there is none before the erection of a commonwealth. And this is also to be gathered out of the ordinary definition of justice in the schools, for they say, that justice is the constant will of giving to every man his own. And therefore where there is no own, that is, no propriety, there is no injustice, and where there is no coercive power erected, that is, where there is no commonwealth, there is no propriety, all men having right to all things, therefore where there is no commonwealth, there nothing is unjust. So that the nature of justice, consisteth in keeping of valid covenants, but the validity of covenants begins not but with the constitution of a civil power, sufficient to compel men to keep them, and then it is also that propriety begins. Justice not contrary to reason. The fool hath sighed in his heart, there is no such thing as justice, and sometimes also with his tongue, seriously alleging, that every man's conservation and contentment, being committed to his own care, there could be no reason, why every man might not do what he thought conduced thereunto, and therefore also to make, or not make, keep, or not keep covenants, was not against reason, when it conduced to one's benefit. He does not therein deny, that there be covenants, and that they are sometimes broken, sometimes kept, and that such breach of them may be called injustice, and the observance of them justice, but he questioneth, whether in justice, taking away the fear of God, for the same fool hath said in his heart there is no God, may not sometimes stand with that reason, which dictateth to every man his own good, and particularly then when it conduceth to such a benefit, as shall put a man in a condition, to neglect not only the dispraise, and revilings, but also the power of other men. The kingdom of God is gotten by violence, but what if it could be gotten by unjust violence? Were it against reason so to get it, when it is impossible to receive hurt by it? And if it be not against reason, it is not against justice, or else justice is not to be approved for good. From such reasoning as this, successful wickedness hath obtained the name of virtue, and some that in all other things have disallowed the violation of faith, yet have allowed it, when it is for the getting of a kingdom. And the heathen that believed, that Saturn was deposed by his son Jupiter, believed nevertheless the same Jupiter to be the avenger of injustice, somewhat like to a piece of law in Coke's commentaries on Lyttelton, where he says, if the right era of the crown be attainted of treason, yet the crown shall descend to him, and eo instante the attender be void, from which instances a man will be very prone to infer, that when the era apparent of a kingdom, shall kill him that is in possession, though his father, you may call it injustice, or by what other name you will, yet it can never be against reason, seeing all the voluntary actions of men tend to the benefit of themselves, and those actions are most reasonable, that conduce most to their ends. This specious reasoning is nevertheless false. For the question is not of promises mutual, where there is no security of performance on either side, as when there is no civil power erected over the parties promising, for such promises are no covenants, but either where one of the parties has performed already, or where there is a power to make him perform, there is the question whether it be against reason, that is, against the benefit of the other to perform, or not. And I say it is not against reason. For the manifestation whereof, we are to consider, first, that when a man doth a thing, which notwithstanding any thing can be foreseen, and reckoned on, tendeth to his own destruction, howsoever some accident which he could not expect, arriving may turn it to his benefit, yet such events do not make it reasonably or wisely done. Secondly, that in a condition of war, wherein every man to every man, for want of a common power to keep them all in awe, is an enemy, there is no man can hope by his own strength, or wit, to defend himself from destruction, without the help of confederates, where every one expects the same defense by the confederation, that any one else does, and therefore he which declares he thinks it reason to deceive those that help him, can in reason expect no other means of safety, than what can be had from his own single power. He therefore that breaketh his covenant, and consequently declareth that he thinks he may with reason do so, cannot be received into any society, that unite themselves for peace and defense, but by the error of them that receive him, nor when he is received, be retained in it, without seeing the danger of their error, which errors a man cannot reasonably reckon upon as the means of his security, and therefore if he be left, or cast out of society, he perisheth, and if he live in society, it is by the errors of other men, which he could not foresee, nor reckon upon, and consequently against the reason of his preservation, and so, as all men that contribute not to his destruction, forbear him only out of ignorance of what is good for themselves. As for the instance of gaining the secure and perpetual felicity of heaven, by any way, it is frivolous, there being but one way imaginable, and that is not breaking, but keeping of covenant. And for the other instance of attaining sovereignty by rebellion, it is manifest, that though the event follow, yet because it cannot reasonably be expected, but rather the contrary, and because by gaining it so, others are taught to gain the same in like manner, the attempt thereof is against reason. Justice therefore, that is to say, keeping of covenant, is a rule of reason, by which we are forbidden to do anything destructive to our life, and consequently a law of nature. There be some that proceed further, and will not have the law of nature, to be those rules which conduce to the preservation of man's life on earth, but to the attaining of an eternal felicity after death, to which they think the breach of covenant may conduce, and consequently be just and reasonable. Such are they that think it a work of merit to kill, or depose, or rebel against, the sovereign power constituted over them by their own consent, but because there is no natural knowledge of man's estate after death, much less say of the reward that is then to be given to breach of faith, but only a belief grounded upon other men's saying, that they know it supernaturally, or that they know those, that knew them, knew others, that knew it supernaturally. Breach of faith cannot be called a precept of reason, or nature. Covenants not discharged by the vice of the person to whom made. Others, that allow for a law of nature, the keeping of faith, do nevertheless make exception of certain persons, as heretic, and such as used not to perform their covenant to others, and this also is against reason. For if any fault of a man be sufficient to discharge our covenant made, the same ought in reason to have been sufficient to have hindered the making of it. Justice of men, and justice of actions what? The names of just and unjust, when they are attributed to men, signify one thing, and when they are attributed to actions, another. When they are attributed to men, they signify conformity, or inconformity of manners, to reason. But when they are attributed to actions, they signify the conformity, or inconformity to reason, not of manners, or manner of life, but of particular actions. A just man therefore, is he that taketh all the care he can, that his actions may be all just, and an unjust man, is he that neglecteth it. And such men are more often in our language styled by the names of righteous, and unrighteous, than just, and unjust, though the meaning be the same. Therefore a righteous man does not lose that title, by one or a few unjust actions, that proceed from sudden passion, or mistake of things, or persons, nor does an unrighteous man lose his character, for such actions, as he does, forbears to do, for fear, because his will is not framed by the justice, but by the apparent benefit of what he is to do. That which gives to humane actions the relish of justice, is a certain nobleness or gallantness of courage, rarely found, by which a man scorns to be beholding for the contentment of his life, to fraud, or breach of promise. This justice of the manners, is that which is meant, where justice is called a virtue, and injustice a vice. But the justice of actions denominates men, not just, but guiltless, and the injustice of the same, which is also called injury, gives them but the name of guilty. Justice of manners, and justice of actions. Again, the injustice of manners, is the disposition, or aptitude to do injury, and is injustice before it proceed to act, and without supposing any individual person injured. But the injustice of an action, that is to say injury, supposeth an individual person injured, namely him to whom the covenant was made, and therefore many times the injury is received by one man, when the damage redoundeth to another. As when the master commandeth his servant to give money to a stranger, if it be not done, the injury is done to the master, whom he had before covenanted to obey, but the damage redoundeth to the stranger, to whom he had no obligation, and therefore could not injure him. And so also in commonwealths, private men may remit to one another their debts, but not robberies or other violences, whereby they are endommaged, because the detaining of debt is an injury to themselves, but robbery and violence are injuries to the person of the commonwealth. Nothing done to a man, by his own consent can be injury. Whatsoever is done to a man, conformable to his own will signify to the doer, is no injury to him. For if he that doeth it, hath not passed away his original right to do what he please, by some antecedent covenant, there is no breach of covenant, and therefore no injury done him. And if he have, then his will to have it done being signified, is a release of that covenant, and so again there is no injury done him. Justice commutative, and distributive. Justice of actions, is by writers divided into commutative, and distributive, and the former they say consisteth in proportion arithmetical, the later in proportion geometrical. Commutative therefore, they place in the equality of value of the things contracted for, and distributive, in the distribution of equal benefit, to men of equal merit. As if it were injustice to sell dearer than we buy, or to give more to a man than he merits. The value of all things contracted for, is measured by the appetite of the contractors, and therefore the just value, is that which they be contented to give. And merit, besides that which is by covenant, where the performance on one part, meriteth the performance of the other part, and falls under justice commutative, not distributive, is not due by justice, but is rewarded of grace only. And therefore this distinction, in the sense wherein it useth to be expounded, is not right. To speak properly, commutative justice, is the justice of a contractor, that is, a performance of covenant, in buying, and selling, hiring, and letting to hire, lending, and borrowing, exchanging, bartering, and other acts of contract. And distributive justice, the justice of an arbitrator, that is to say, the act of defining what is just. Wherein, being trusted by them that make him arbitrator, if he perform his trust, he is said to distribute to every man his own, and his is indeed just distribution, and may be called, though improperly, distributive justice, but more properly equity, which also is a law of nature, as shall be shown in due place. The fourth law of nature, gratitude. As justice dependeth on antecedent covenant, so does gratitude depend on antecedent grace, that is to say, antecedent free gift, and is the fourth law of nature, which may be conceived in this form, that a man which receiveth benefit from another of mere grace, endeavor that he which giveth it, have no reasonable cause to repent him of his good will. For no man giveth, but with intention of good to himself, because gift is voluntary, and of all voluntary acts, the object is to every man his own good, of which if men see they shall be frustrated, there will be no beginning of benevolence, or trust, nor consequently of mutual help, nor of reconciliation of one man to another, and therefore they are to remain still in the condition of war, which is contrary to the first and fundamental law of nature, which commandeth men to seek peace. The breach of this law is called ingratitude, and hath the same relation to grace, that injustice hath to obligation by covenant. The fifth, mutual accommodation, or complaisance. A fifth law of nature is complaisance, that is to say, that every man strive to accommodate himself to the rest. For the understanding whereof, we may consider, that there is in men's aptness to society, a diversity of nature, rising from their diversity of affections, not unlike to that we see in stones brought together for building of an edifice. For is that stone which by the asperity, and irregularity of figure, takes more room from others, than itself fills, and for the hardness, cannot be easily made plain, and thereby hindereth the building, is by the builders cast away as unprofitable, and troublesome, so also, a man that by asperity of nature, will strive to retain those things which to himself are superfluous, and to others necessary, and for the stubbornness of his passions, cannot be corrected, is to be left, or cast out of society, as cumbersome thereunto. For seeing every man, not only by right, but also by necessity of nature, is supposed to endeavor all he can, to obtain that which is necessary for his conservation, he that shall oppose himself against it, for things superfluous, is guilty of the war that thereupon is to follow, and therefore doth that, which is contrary to the fundamental law of nature, which commandeth to seek peace. The observers of this law may be called sociable, the Latines call them commodi, the contrary, stubborn, and sociable, froward, intractable. The sixth, facility to pardon. A sixth law of nature is this, that upon caution of the future time, a man ought to pardon the offences past of them that repenting, desire it. For pardon is nothing but granting of peace, which though granted to them that persevere in their hostility, be not peace, but fear, yet not granted to them that give caution of the future time, is signa of an aversion to peace, and therefore contrary to the law of nature. The seventh, that in revenges, men respect only the future good. A seventh is, that in revenges, that is, retribution of evil for evil, men look not at the greatness of the evil past, but the greatness of the good to follow. Whereby we are forbidden to inflict punishment with any other design, than for correction of the offender, or direction of others. For this law is consequent to the next before it, that commandeth pardon, upon security of the future time. Besides, revenge without respect to the example, and profit to come, is a triumph, or glorying in the hurt of another, tending to no end. For the end is always somewhat to come, and glorying to no end, is vainglory, and contrary to reason, and to hurt without reason, tendeth to the introduction of war, which is against the law of nature, and is commonly styled by the name of cruelty. The eighth, against contumely. And because all signa of hatred, or contempt, provoke to fight, insomuch as most men choose rather to hazard their life, than not to be revenged, we may in the eighth place, for a law of nature set down this precept, that no man by deed, word, countenance, or gesture, declare hatred, or contempt of another. The breach of which law, is commonly called contumely. The ninth, against pride. The question who is the better man, has no place in the condition of mere nature, where, as has been shown before, all men are equal. The inequality that now is, has been introduced by the laws civil. I know that Aristotle in the first book of his Politique, for a foundation of his doctrine, maketh men by nature, some more worthy to command, meaning the wiser sort, such as he thought himself to be for his philosophy, others to serve, meaning those that had strong bodies, but were not philosophers as he, as if master and servant were not introduced by consent of men, but by difference of wit, which is not only against reason, but also against experience. For there are very few so foolish, that had not rather govern themselves, than be governed by others, nor when the wise in their own conceit, contend by force, with them who distrust their own wisdom, do they all wise, or often, or almost at any time, get the victory. If nature therefore have made men equal, that equality is to be acknowledged, or if nature have made men unequal, yet because men that think themselves equal, will not enter into conditions of peace, but upon equal terms, such equality must be admitted. And therefore for the ninth law of nature, I put this, that every man acknowledge other for his equal by nature. The breach of this precept is pride. The 10th against arrogance. On this law, dependeth another, that at the entrance into conditions of peace, no man required to reserve to himself any right, which he is not content should be reserved to every one of the rest. As it is necessary for all men that seek peace, to lay down certain rights of nature, that is to say, not to have liberty to do all they list, so is it necessary for man's life, to retain some, as right to govern their own bodies, enjoy air, water, motion, wise to go from place to place, and all things else without which a man cannot live, or not live well. If in this case, at the making of peace, men require for themselves, that which they would not have to be granted to others, they do contrary to the precedent law, that commandeth the acknowledgement of natural equality, and therefore also against the law of nature. The observers of this law are those we call modest, and the breakers arrogant men. The Greeks call the violation of this law pleonexia, that is, a desire of more than their share. The 11th equity. Also, if a man be trusted to judge between man and man, it is a precept of the law of nature, that he deal equally between them. For without that, the controversies of men cannot be determined but by war. He therefore that is partial in judgment, doth what in him lies, to deter men from the use of judges, and arbitrators, and consequently, against the fundamental law of nature, is the cause of war. The observance of this law, from the equal distribution to each man, of that which in reason belongeth to him, is called equity, and, as I have said before, distributive justice, the violation, exception of persons, prosopolepsia. The 12th, equal use of things common. And from this followeth another law, that such things as cannot be divided, be enjoyed in common, if it can be, and if the quantity of the thing permit, without stint, otherwise proportionably to the number of them that have right. For otherwise the distribution is unequal, and contrary to equity. The 13th, of lot. But some things there be, that can neither be divided, nor enjoyed in common. Then, the law of nature, which prescribeth equity, requireth, that the entire right, or else, making the use alternate, the first possession, be determined by lot. For equal distribution, is of the law of nature, and other means of equal distribution cannot be imagined. The 14th, of primogeniture, and first sizing. Of lots there be two sorts, arbitrary and natural. Arbitrary is that which is agreed on by the competitors. Natural is either primogeniture, which the Greek calls kleronomia, which signifies, given by lot, or first seizure. And therefore those things which cannot be enjoyed in common nor divided, ought to be adjudged to the first possessor, and in some cases to the firstborn, as acquired by lot. The 15th, of mediators. It is also a law of nature, that all men that mediate peace, be allowed safe conduct. For the law that commandeth peace, as the end, commandeth intercession, as the means, and to intercession the means is safe conduct. The 16th, of submission to arbitrament. And because, though men be never so willing to observe these laws, there may nevertheless arise questions concerning a man's action. First, whether it were done, or not done. Secondly, if done, whether against the law, or not against the law. The former whereof, is called a question of fact, the later a question of right. Therefore unless the parties to the question, covenant mutually to stand to the sentence of another, they are as far from peace as ever. This other, to whose sentence they submit, is called an arbitrator. And therefore it is of the law of nature, that they that are at controversy, submit their right to the judgment of an arbitrator. The 17th, no man is his own judge. And seeing every man is presumed to do all things in order to his own benefit, no man is a fit arbitrator in his own cause, and if he were never so fit, yet equity allowing to each party equal benefit, if one be admitted to be judge, the other is to be admitted also, and so the controversy, that is, the cause of war, remains against the law of nature. The 18th, no man to be judge, that has in him cause of partiality. For the same reason no man in any cause ought to be received for arbitrator, to whom greater profit, or honor, or pleasure apparently ariseth out of the victory of one party, than of the other, for he hath taken, though an unavoidable bribe, yet a bribe, and no man can be obliged to trust him. And thus also the controversy, and the condition of war remaineth, contrary to the law of nature. The 19th, of witness. And in a controversy of fact, the judge being to give no more credit to one, than to the other, if there be no other arguments, must give credit to a third, or to a third and fourth, or more, for else the question is undecided, and left to force, contrary to the law of nature. These are the laws of nature, dictating peace, for a means of the conservation of men in multitudes, and which only concern the doctrine of civil society. There be other things tending to the destruction of particular men, as drunkenness, and all other parts of intemperance, which may therefore also be reckoned amongst those things which the law of nature hath forbidden, but are not necessary to be mentioned, nor are pertinent enough to this place. A rule, by which the laws of nature may easily be examined. And though this may seem too subtle a deduction of the laws of nature, to be taken notice of by all men, whereof the most part are too busy in getting food, and the rest too negligent to understand, yet to leave all men unexcusable, they have been contracted into one easy sum, intelligible even to the meanest capacity, and that is, do not that to another, which thou wouldest not have done to thyself, which showeth him, that he has no more to do in learning the laws of nature, but, when weighing the actions of other men with his own, they seem too heavy, to put them into the other part of the balance, and his own into their place, that his own passions, and self-love, may add nothing to the weight, and then there is none of these laws of nature that will not appear unto him very reasonable. The laws of nature oblige in conscience always. But in effect then only when there is security the laws of nature oblige in foro interno, that is to say, they bind to a desire they should take place, but in foro externo, that is, to the putting them in act, not always. For he that should be modest, and tractable, and perform all he promises, in such time and place, where no man else should do so, should but make himself a prey to others, and procure his own certain ruin, contrary to the ground of all laws of nature, which tend to nature's preservation. And again, he that shall observe the same laws towards him, observes them not himself, seeketh not peace, but war, and consequently the destruction of his nature by violence. And whatsoever laws bind in foro interno, may be broken, not only by a fact contrary to the law but also by a fact according to it, in case a man think it contrary. For though his action in this case be according to the law, which where the obligation is in foro interno, is a breach. The laws of nature are eternal. The laws of nature are immutable and eternal, for injustice, ingratitude, arrogance, pride, iniquity, exception of persons, and the rest, can never be made lawful. For it can never be that war shall preserve life, and peace destroy it. And yet easy. The same laws, because they oblige only to a desire and endeavor, I mean an unfeigned and constant endeavor, are easy to be observed. For in that they require nothing but endeavor, he that endeavoreth their performance, fulfilleth them, and he that fulfilleth the law, is just. The science of these laws, is the true moral philosophy. And the science of them, is the true and only moral philosophy. For moral philosophy is nothing else but the science of what is good, and of ill, in the conversation, and society of mankind. Good and of ill, are names that signify our appetites, and aversions, which in different tempers, customs, and doctrines of men, are different, and divers men, differ not only in their judgment, on the senses of what is pleasant, and unpleasant to the taste, smell, hearing, touch, and sight, but also of what is conformable, or disagreeable to reason, in the actions of common life. Nay, the same man, in divers times, differs from himself, and one time praiseth, that is, calleth good, what another time he dispraiseth, and calleth evil, from whence arise disputes, controversies, and at last war. And therefore so long as man is in the condition of mere nature, which is a condition of war, as private appetite is the measure of good, and of ill, and consequently all men agree on this, that peace is good, and therefore also the way, or means of peace, which, as I have showed before, are justice, gratitude, modesty, equity, mercy, and the rest of the laws of nature, are good, that is to say, moral virtues, and their contrary vices, of ill. Now the science of virtue and vice, is moral philosophy, and therefore the true doctrine of the laws of nature, is the true moral philosophy. But the writers of moral philosophy, though they acknowledge the same virtues and vices, yet not seeing wherein consisted their goodness, nor that they come to be praised, as the means of peaceable, sociable, and comfortable living, place them in a mediocrity of passions, as if not the cause, but the degree of daring, made fortitude, or not the cause, but the quantity of a gift, made liberality. These dictates of reason, men used to call by the name of laws, but improperly, for they are but conclusions, or theorems concerning what conduceth to the conservation and defense of themselves, whereas law, properly is the word of him, that by right hath command over others. But yet if we consider the same theorems, as delivered in the word of God, that by right commandeth all things, then are they properly called laws. Chapter 16. Of persons, authors, and things personated. A person what? A person is he whose words or actions are considered, either as his own, or as representing the words or actions of an other man, or of any other thing to whom they are attributed, whether truly or by fiction. Person natural and artificial. When they are considered as his own, then is he called a natural person, and when they are considered as representing the words and actions of an other, then is he a feigned or artificial person. The word person, whence? The word person is Latine, instead whereof the Greeks had prosopon, which signifies the face, as persona in Latine signifies the disguise, or outward appearance of a man, counterfeited on the stage, and sometimes more particularly that part of it, which disguiseth the face, as a mask or visored, and from the stage, hath been translated to any representer of speech and action, as well in tribunals, as theatres. So that a person, is the same that an actor is, both on the stage and in common conversation, and to personate, is to act, or represent himself, or an other, and he that acteth another, is said to be or his person, or act in his name. In which sense Cicero useth it where he sighs, unus sustineo tres personas, me, adversarii and judices, I bear three persons, my own, my adversaries, and the judges, and is called in diverse occasions, diversely, as a representer, or representative, a lieutenant, a vicar, an attorney, a deputy, a procurator, an actor, and the like. Actor, author, authority. Of persons artificial, some have their words and actions owned by those whom they represent. And then the person is the actor, and he that owneth his words and actions, is the author, in which case the actor acteth by authority. For that which in speaking of goods and possessions, is called an owner, and in Latine dominus, in Greek kurios, speaking of actions, is called author. And as the right of possession, is called dominion, so the right of doing any action, is called authority. So that by authority, is always understood a right of doing any act, and done by authority, done by commission, or license from him whose right it is. Covenants by authority, bind the author. From hence it followeth, that when the actor maketh a covenant by authority, he bindeth thereby the author, no less than if he had made it himself, and no less subjecteth him to all the consequences of the same. And therefore all that hath been said formerly, chapter 14, of the nature of covenants between man and man in their natural capacity, is true also when they are made by their actors, representers, or procurators, that have authority from them, so far forth as is in their commission, but no farther. And therefore he that maketh a covenant with the actor, or representer, not knowing the authority he hath, doth it at his own peril. For no man is obliged by a covenant, whereof he is not author, nor consequently by a covenant made against, or beside the authority he gave. But not the actor. When the actor doth any thing against the law of nature by command of the author, if he be obliged by former covenant to obey him, not he, but the author breaketh the law of nature, for though the action be against the law of nature, yet it is not his, but contrarily, to refuse to do it, is against the law of nature, that forbiddeth breach of covenant. The authority is to be shown. And he that maketh a covenant with the author, by mediation of the actor, not knowing what authority he hath, but only takes his word, in case such authority be not made manifest unto him upon demand, is no longer obliged, for the covenant made with the author, is not valid, without his counter assurance. But if he that so covenanteth, knew beforehand he was to expect no other assurance, than the actor's word, then is the covenant valid, because the actor in this case maketh himself the author. And therefore, as when the authority is evident, the covenant obligeth the author, not the actor, so when the authority is feigned, it obligeth the actor only, there being no author but himself. Things personated, inanimate. There are few things that are incapable of being represented by fiction. Inanimate things, as a church, an hospital, a bridge, may be personated by a rector, master, or overseer. But things inanimate cannot be authors, nor therefore give authority to their actors, yet the actors may have authority to procure their maintenance, given them by those that are owners, or governors of those things. And therefore, such things cannot be personated, before there be some state of civil government. Irrational. Likewise children, fools, and madmen that have no use of reason, may be personated by guardians, or curators, but can be no authors, during that time, of any action done by them longer than, when they shall recover the use of reason, they shall judge the same reasonable. Yet during the folly, he that hath right of governing them, may give authority to the guardian. But this again has no place but in a state civil, because before such a state, there is no dominion of persons. False gods. An idol, or mere figment of the brain, may be personated, as were the gods of the heathen, which by such officers as the state appointed, were personated, and held possessions, and other goods, and rights, which men from time to time dedicated, and consecrated unto them. But idols cannot be authors, for an idol is nothing. The authority proceeded from the state, and therefore before introduction of civil government, the gods of the heathen could not be personated. The true God. The true God may be personated. As he was, first, by Moses, who governed the Israelites, that were not his, but God's people, not in his own name, with hoc dicit Moses, but in God's name, with hoc dicit Dominus. Secondly, by the Son of Man, his own Son, our blessed Savior Jesus Christ, that came to reduce the Jews, and induce all nations into the kingdom of his Father, not as of himself, but is sent from his Father. And thirdly, by the Holy Ghost, or Comforter, speaking, and working in the apostles, which Holy Ghost, was a Comforter that came not of himself, but was sent and proceeded from them both. A multitude of men, how one person? A multitude of men are made one person, when they are by one man, or one person, represented, so that it be done with the consent of every one of that multitude in particular. For it is the unity of the representer, not the unity of the represented, that maketh the person one. And it is the representer that beareth the person, and but one person, and unity, cannot otherwise be understood in multitude. Every one is author. And because the multitude naturally is not one, but many, they cannot be understood for one, but many authors, of everything their representative faith, or doth in their name, every man giving their common representer, authority from himself in particular, and owning all the actions the representer doth, in case they give him authority without stint, otherwise, when they limit him in what, and how far he shall represent them, none of them owneth more, than they gave him commission to act. An actor may be many men made one by plurality of voices. And if the representative consist of many men, the voice of the greater number must be considered as the voice of them all. For if the lesser number pronounce, for example, in the affirmative, and the greater in the negative, there will be negatives more than enough to destroy the affirmatives, and thereby the excess of negatives, standing uncontradicted, are the only voice the representative hath. Representatives, when the number is even, unprofitable. And a representative of even number, especially when the number is not great, whereby the contradictory voices are oftentimes equal, is therefore oftentimes mute, and incapable of action. Yet in some cases contradictory voices equal in number, may determine a question, as in condemning, or absolving, the quality of votes, even in that they condemn not, do absolve, but not on the contrary condemn, in that they absolve not. For when a cause is heard, not to condemn, is to absolve, but on the contrary, to say that not absolving, is condemning, is not true. The like it is in a deliberation of executing presently, or deferring till another time, for when the voices are equal, the not decreeing execution, is a decree of dilation. Negative voice. Or if the number be oddity, as 3, or more, men, or assemblies, whereof every one has by a negative voice, authority to take away the effect of all the affirmative voices of the rest, this number is no representative, because by the diversity of opinions, and interests of men, it becomes oftentimes, and in cases of the greatest consequence, a mute person, and unapt, as for many things else, so for the government of a multitude, especially in time of war. Of authors there be two sorts. The first simply so called, which I have before defined to be him, that owneth the action of another simply. The second is he, that owneth an action, or covenant of another conditionally, that is to say, he undertaketh to do it, if the other doth it not, at, or before a certain time. And these authors conditional, are generally called sureties, in Latine fidegisors, and sponsors, and particularly for debt, preeds, and for appearance before a judge, or magistrate, fates,